The emergency room had seen bad nights before. This was not a bad night. This was the kind of night that ends careers, breaks people, and leaves scars that don't show up on any chart. A soldier arrived with his chest half destroyed, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him 3 times over, and every doctor in that trauma bay stood frozen like they'd never seen real damage before. Every doctor except the nurse they'd spent 6 months making miserable. She stepped forward without a word, rid the wounds in under 4 seconds, and started issuing orders that nobody had the sense to argue with. The soldier's eyes found hers through the chaos. His hand closed around her wrist, and he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You're not just a nurse, are you?" If this story hits you the way it hit me, subscribe to this channel and stay until the very end, like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hartwell Regional Medical Center sat at the edge of Calverton, a mid-sized military town in the kind of geography that looks beautiful in photographs and feels exhausting to actually live in. Mountains to the west, flat industrial sprawl to the east, and a military installation close enough that the hospital handled trauma cases most civilian facilities never saw. The ER was busy on a Tuesday in a way that felt personal, like the night itself had a grudge. Mara Quinn moved through it the way she always did, efficiently, without announcing herself, doing 3 things at once while managing to look like she was doing none of them. She was 34 years old with the kind of stillness in her face that people sometimes mistook for passivity. That was their first mistake. It was never the last. She had been at Hartwell for 8 months. In that time, she had been written up twice for overstepping, had 2 formal complaints filed against her by attending physicians who didn't like the way she flagged their decisions, and had been removed from the cardiac rotation by Dr. Raymond Ashby, the ER director, who told her plainly that she was creating tension in the department by acting outside her scope. She was, by every metric the hospital used, a problem. What those metrics didn't capture, she had also identified a missed aortic dissection in a 41-year-old who came in presenting as a panic attack, caught a double drug interaction that the attending had overlooked in a 63-year-old post-op patient, and quietly corrected a blood type mismatch in the transfusion queue that would have killed the man in bed 7 before anybody realized what happened. None of those corrections appeared on her record. The 2 write-ups did. That was the arrangement. Dr. Raymond Ashby ran the Hartwell ER the way certain men run things, through the consistent application of authority and the occasional selective use of facts. He was 51, kept himself in good shape, wore his confidence the way other people wore cologne. Too much, and it arrived before he did. He had a medical degree from a school that he mentioned within the first 10 minutes of meeting someone, a collection of commendations on his office wall, and a staff that had learned over 4 years of working under him that there were 2 categories of correct, what was actually correct and what Ashby said. Those 2 categories did not always overlap. He didn't dislike Mara Quinn specifically. He disliked what she represented, which was the quiet, persistent suggestion that he might not be the most competent person in the room. That particular suggestion was not something Raymond Ashby had any patience for. "She flagged my intubation depth again," he'd said to his charge nurse, Donna Oates, 2 weeks earlier. "3rd time. You know what that is? That's insubordination dressed up as clinical concern." Donna, who had been a nurse for 22 years and recognized genuine clinical concern when she saw it, said nothing. That was also the arrangement. The shift that changed everything started at 6:48 p.m. Mara was finishing a chart at the workstation near Trauma Bay 2 when the radio traffic picked up. The kind of rapid, clipped exchange between paramedics and dispatch that meant something serious was inbound. She didn't stop charting, but she listened. "Hartwell, we have a 37-year-old male, military ID confirmed, GSW to the right chest and upper left abdomen, BP 70 over palp, tachy at 140, GCS 14. We've got 2 large bore IVs running wide open. He's been down approximately 19 minutes field time." She set down her pen. 19 minutes of hemodynamic instability with that BP and heart rate, GSW to the chest and abdomen. Not a through and through. The paramedic hadn't mentioned an exit wound, which meant retained ballistic injury. The abdomen was the time bomb. Solid organs with vascular compromise. Internal bleeding she couldn't quantify from here, but could estimate based on mechanism and the numbers coming over the radio. She was already calculating. The trauma bay doors burst open 4 minutes later, and Mara had the bay prepped, IV lines confirmed, the O-neg blood out of the emergency supply and running, ultrasound machine positioned, the crash cart unlocked. She had done it quietly, without announcement, without asking permission. Dr. Ashby came through the doors behind the gurney with 2 residents flanking him, and he saw the setup and his jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the patient on the table. The man on the gurney was built, 6'2", maybe 6'3", broad across the shoulders with the kind of muscle mass that came from something more disciplined than a gym membership. It was in civilian clothes, but there was military-issue gear still on him, partially cut away by the paramedics. His face was pale and tight with the particular concentration of someone who is using everything they have just to stay conscious. There was a tactical tourniquet on his left thigh that the paramedics had applied. A secondary injury, not the primary one, but someone had been thorough. His name, per the ID the paramedics had managed to get from his wallet, was Marcus Delaney. Get me a chest X-ray and CT of the abdomen, CBC, BMP, coag panel, Ashby started. He can't make it to CT, Mara said. The room did that thing it did when she spoke, a fractional pause, like a skipped beat. She didn't look at Ashby when she said it. She was looking at Delaney. Excuse me? Ashby's voice had the tone of a man who had rehearsed this response enough times that it was almost automatic. His pressure's dropping. He won't tolerate the movement, and if there's solid organ injury, which there is, we're going to lose him in the hallway on the way to imaging. She moved to the ultrasound machine. Fast exam first, right here. Then we make a decision. I'll decide what we... Do it, Delaney said from the gurney. His voice was rougher than gravel and quieter than it should have been for a man his size. She's right. The room went very still. Ashby's face did something complicated. A beat of silence. Then, because the alternative was arguing with a critically injured patient in front of 2 residents and 3 nurses, he stepped back. Mara ran the fast exam, the rapid bedside ultrasound that could identify free fluid in the abdomen. And what it showed her confirmed what she'd already suspected. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch, free fluid in the splenorenal space. Significant. The spleen was compromised, possibly the left lobe of the liver, and the bleeding was active. He needs the OR, she said. Now. Not in 10 minutes. Now. Call vascular in general, get an OR suite open, and page whoever's on trauma call. You do not give orders in my... His pressure just dropped to 62. This from one of the residents, a second-year named Callum Reese, who was watching the monitor with the focused alarm of someone who was new enough to still be scared by the numbers. Dr. Ashby, I can see the monitor, Reese. But he was already moving, because whatever else Raymond Ashby was, he wasn't going to let a patient die in his ER over a power struggle. He called for the OR. He paged the trauma surgeon. He gave the orders Mara had laid out 30 seconds earlier as though they were his own. He didn't look at her once. She didn't care. She was already at Delaney's side, adjusting the pressure dressing on his chest wound, talking to him in a low, steady voice. Not the kind of reassuring patter that nurses use to calm frightened people, but something more specific, more direct. Stay with me, she said. Keep your eyes open. Tell me your unit. It was an odd thing to say. The resident, Callum Reese, noticed it. He didn't understand it yet. Delaney looked up at her, his eyes, gray, sharp even through the blood loss, focused on her face. Bravo 3, he said. You know what that means. I know exactly what it means, she said. So you know what that means for you. You don't check out, you understand? Something moved across his face. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Copy that, he said. They moved him to OR2 in under 4 minutes. Mara handed off to the trauma surgeon, Dr. Felicia Park, who arrived at a controlled sprint and took one look at the fast results Mara held out to her and said, Good call on skipping CT. No qualifier, no hedge, just the assessment. Mara nodded once and stepped back. She walked back to the ER. She finished her chart. She took a blood pressure on an elderly man in bed 3 who was waiting for cardiology consult. She restocked the supply cart near the nursing station. She did all of it while waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped 11 minutes later. Raymond Ashby's office was glass-walled, a design choice he had championed when the department was renovated 2 years ago because he believed in transparency. What he meant, practically, was that he could see the floor and the floor could see him. Visibility as a management tool. When he called Mara into his office, she could count 3 nurses and 1 resident watching through the glass as she sat down. Ashby didn't sit. He stood behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface, which was the posture of a man who had decided on the outcome before the conversation began. "You overrode my clinical assessment in front of my staff," he said. "I provided a clinical recommendation. You told my resident what to do. You told my patient that I was wrong. I told the patient what I assessed. He agreed." "He agreed." Ashby repeated it like it was absurd. "He's a trauma patient, Quinn. He was in hemorrhagic shock. His agreement kept him alive long enough for the OR team to stop the bleeding," Mara said. She kept her voice level. Not cold. She wasn't trying for cold. She was trying for accurate. "If we'd taken him to CT first, he would have arrested in the scanner. You don't know that." "The trauma surgeon agreed with my assessment. Dr. Park is not your supervisor." "No," Mara said. "You are." The acknowledgement seemed to throw him for just a moment. He'd expected more pushback, she could tell. He recalibrated. "I've been lenient with you," he said, "because your technical skills are adequate and because replacing staff mid-cycle is a process I'd rather avoid. But this is the 4th time in 2 months that you've undermined my authority in front of the team, and I'm not going to continue absorbing that. I flagged clinical concerns through appropriate channels, and you've made me look incompetent in front of residents and patients." He said it cleanly, without embarrassment, like a man who had decided honesty was a weapon he could afford to use. "That's what it is, whatever you call it." Mara looked at him. "Is the patient alive?" Ashby's jaw tightened. "Yes," she said, answering herself. "He is, because somebody caught the right thing at the right time." She stood up. "Write it up however you need to. I'll wait." She was at the door when he spoke again. "You're off the trauma rotation, effective tonight. You'll be reassigned to the general medical floor starting tomorrow morning." She didn't stop walking. "You're welcome to file a grievance," he added. She let the door close behind her. The medical floor was quieter. That was what people said about it. Quieter. The way they said safer when they meant lesser. Mara had been up here for 3 days when the shift happened. She was checking medication dosages at the nursing station on the 4th floor. When Donna Oates, the charge nurse from the ER, who had been working at Hartwell long enough to have opinions she kept private, appeared at the elevator, slightly out of breath. "He's asking for you," Donna said. Mara looked up. "Who is?" "The soldier, Delaney. He's out of the ICU. They moved him to the surgical recovery floor this morning, and he's been asking." Donna paused. "Specifically for you, by name." "He doesn't know my name." "He apparently does." Mara set down the chart she was holding. She found Marcus Delaney in a private room at the end of a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. He was sitting up slightly, less pale than he'd been, with the careful posture of a man managing pain that he refused to acknowledge. There were drainage tubes and an IV line, and a significant quantity of bandaging under the hospital gown. And he looked like he'd survived something serious because he had. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression settled, the particular quality of relief that comes from recognizing someone you weren't sure you'd see again. "You moved fast," he said. "In the ER. Standard protocol." "No, it wasn't." He said it without heat. "Just a correction. I've been in enough trauma environments to know what standard protocol looks like. What you did wasn't standard." He paused. "The fast exam before CT, the OR call, the way you talked to me." He watched her. "Where'd you train?" "Nursing school. University of..." "Before that." The room was very quiet. Mara stood near the door with her hands loose at her sides. She recognized the shape of this moment. She'd seen it before, in different rooms, in different contexts, always with the same particular feeling of something sealed beginning to open. "You should rest," she said. "Mara Quinn," he said. "That's a civilian name. But the way you looked at my tourniquet when they brought me in, you checked the placement, not the wound. The tourniquet placement first. That's not something they teach in nursing school." She said nothing. "Bravo 3, he said. "You know what that is?" "I watched your face when I said it." "Get some sleep, Mr. Delaney." "Marcus." He shifted against the pillows. and the effort cost him something he didn't show on his face. Do you remember a village outside Mahad province? 2017. Night operation. 3 vehicles compromised, 6 men down. The medic who came in on the extraction bird and spent 4 hours in a shot-up building keeping 3 of my guys alive until evac was possible. He stopped. I remember the medic. I didn't know the name until recently. The silence stretched. You're wrong, Mara said. I'm not. He met her eyes. And the people looking for you, because they are looking, they're going to reach the same conclusion pretty quickly. She looked at him for a long moment. His face was steady, certain, and something else. Something that might have been gratitude if gratitude looked like absolute conviction. I'm just a nurse, she said. Okay, he said. She left the room. She walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, waited. The doors opened. She stepped in, turned, and watched the corridor as the doors closed. Her face was still, her hands were steady, but her mind was already moving very fast. The next 12 hours were routine, on the surface. Mara completed her shift, did her documentation, drove home to the small apartment 3 miles from the hospital, ran 4 miles in the dark at 5 in the morning, and came back to her next shift having slept approximately 3.5 hours. She had spent the rest of the night thinking, not about what Delaney had said. She'd processed that quickly. She spent the night thinking about what came next because she knew what came next. And she'd had 8 years to build an ordinary life. And she'd done it carefully, and she was not particularly interested in watching it disassemble. What she didn't account for was how fast it was already moving. She was 40 minutes into her shift when Donna Oates found her again, this time on the medical floor rather than at the elevators. And this time Donna looked different, not anxious different, something else. The particular look of a person who has seen something they weren't prepared for. There are people downstairs, Donna said, in the lobby. People. Military, not regular uniform. I don't know the insignia, 3 of them. And they went to the administrative desk and asked for the director. And they said they needed to speak with the medical staff involved in treating a patient named Marcus Delaney. Donna paused. And one of them handed the desk coordinator a card. And she came and found me because I was in the ER that night. And Donna stopped. Mara. The card had a JSOC seal on it. Mara kept her expression neutral. Okay. Do you know what JSOC is? Joint Special Operations Command. Why would JSOC be at Hartwell Regional? Mara looked at her for a moment. I'll go down, she said. Mara, it's fine, Donna. She took the stairs. She came down 3 floors and pushed through the door into the ground floor corridor and stopped before she reached the lobby, just far enough back that she could see through the glass partition without being immediately visible herself. 3 people. 2 men in what appeared to be civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes didn't quite fit when worn by people whose natural habitat was a uniform. 1 woman in full military dress. Navy, from the insignia. A commander, from the rank. And beside the commander sitting on the floor near the lobby chairs because he was apparently too large to be comfortable in any of the available seating, was a dog. Not a pet. A working dog. Belgian Malinois, in a tactical vest, ears up and alert, and scanning the lobby with the comprehensive attention of an animal that is specifically trained to not miss things. Mara recognized a military K9 unit when she saw one. She also recognized, standing at the reception desk with his hand on his hip and his chest out, and his voice at the particular volume of a man accustomed to being in charge of rooms, Dr. Raymond Ashby. She couldn't hear him through the glass, but she could read the body language. He was explaining something that required him to gesture toward the upper floors and then toward himself, and then toward the military personnel with the particular physical vocabulary of a man establishing his authority. The Navy commander was not impressed. That was visible from 30 feet away. The woman said something short and direct, and Ashby's chest-out posture contracted by about 20%. Mara watched for another moment, then she pushed through the glass door and walked into the lobby. She saw the commander see her before Ashby did. The man's eyes, experienced, assessing, tracked to her the moment she came through the door, and something in his recognition shifted. Not surprise, more like confirmation. The K9 lifted its head. Dr. Ashby, Mara said, because it was easier to start there. Ashby turned. His expression went through 3 things quickly: surprise, irritation, and then the particular set of calculation that she'd learned to recognize over 8 months of watching him decide how to use situations to his advantage. Quinn, this doesn't concern you. Go back to Commander Walsh. The Navy commander spoke over him, directly to Mara. I'm Commander Julia Walsh, Naval Special Warfare. This is Lieutenant Erickson, and this is Sergeant Briggs and his partner, Colt. She indicated the K-9, who did not move but whose ears tracked toward Mara with focused precision. We're here in connection with the patient Marcus Delaney. I understand you were involved in his initial care. Ashby stepped forward. I was the attending physician of record for that case. The nurse was present in a supporting capacity. Were you the first to assess the need to bypass CT and move directly to surgical intervention? Commander Walsh asked. To Mara, not to Ashby. Mara looked at her. I recommended it. The trauma surgeon made the final call. Who recommended the FAST exam prior to imaging? I did. Who placed the initial assessment of solid organ hemorrhage? I did. Walsh nodded, just once. She looked at Mara with the particular directness of someone who has spent a career evaluating people under pressure and has developed very reliable instincts about what they're seeing. We'd like to speak with you privately, Walsh said, if that's possible. She's on shift, Ashby said. His voice had taken on an edge now. Not loud, but sharp. She has patient responsibilities, and this hospital operates under Dr. Ashby. Walsh turned to him with the measured patience of someone who is choosing courtesy because they don't need to choose otherwise. We'll require approximately 40 minutes. If there's a staffing concern, I'd recommend you address it. We'll be in whatever room you can provide. It was not a request. Ashby looked at her. He looked at the two men flanking her. He looked at the K-9, which looked back at him with the unblinking, perfectly calm assessment of an animal that has been trained in situations dramatically more serious than this one. He didn't say anything else. Mara followed Commander Walsh toward the conference room near the administrative wing, and as she walked past the reception desk, she caught a glimpse of Donna Oates at the edge of the corridor, watching. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. But she could feel the shape of the thing that was about to happen, the way you can feel a storm before it arrives. Not in the sky yet, but in the air, in the pressure, in some animal awareness of change that no amount of careful, ordinary living had ever quite quieted in her. She had spent 8 years being no one. She'd been good at it. She had a feeling the 8 years were over. The conference room was small and smelled like stale coffee. Walsh closed the door herself, and the two men took positions near the walls that were not threatening, but were not casual either. The dog sat between Walsh and Mara and looked at nothing and everything at once. Walsh set a folder on the table. She didn't open it. I'm going to be direct with you, she said, because I think you'd prefer that. I would, Mara said. Marcus Delaney told us who he believed you were before we ran the confirmation. We ran the confirmation this morning. Walsh's voice was even, completely measured, but there was something underneath it, something that was not quite formal. The fingerprints from your nursing license application matched service records. The records were archived under a different protocol, which is why they didn't surface through standard background checks when you took this position. She paused. You were thorough. Mara said nothing. Specialist First Class Mara Quinn, Walsh said, previously attached to the 75th Special Operations Medical Battalion on rotation with multi-agency rescue coordination. 3 confirmed extractions under hostile fire. The Mahad Province operation in 2017. 6 casualties, 3 critical, all 3 survived. A commendation was submitted and subsequently withdrawn at your own request. She looked up from the folder. You left the service 6 months after that operation. Medical discharge, listed as voluntary transition, no forwarding contact. The room was very quiet. I left, Mara said. That's accurate. Why? She considered the question. Lots of reasons. Would you like to be more specific? Not particularly. She kept her voice even, not defensive, just clear. I made a decision. It was my decision to make. Walsh studied her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. Delaney's alive because you made the right call in under 4 minutes with a patient you'd never seen before, Walsh said. With an ER director blocking you in a trauma bay that wasn't prepped when the patient arrived. Because you prepped it without being asked before the ambulance came in. We spoke with the paramedics. We spoke with Dr. Park. She's the one who operated. She told us the fast results you produced were textbook precise, and that your clinical assessment saved her approximately 8 minutes of diagnostic time. In that context, 8 minutes was the difference between a controlled surgical approach and a crash laparotomy. Walsh paused. She said she hadn't seen that kind of bedside assessment from anyone outside a level 1 trauma center, and she's worked in 3 of them. Mara looked at the folder on the table. Dr. Ashby is going to file a formal complaint about today. Yes, Walsh said. He might. He's been building a case to remove me from this facility for 4 months. Walsh's eyes steadied. I know. We're aware of Dr. Ashby's complaints. We're also aware of several other things about Dr. Ashby's department. She let that sit for a moment, deliberate and precise. That's a separate conversation. Mara looked at her. Something in that last sentence landed with a weight that Walsh clearly intended it to carry. What are you here for? Mara asked. Walsh clasped her hands on the table. The dog shifted slightly, settling. We're here because Marcus Delaney is a critical asset whose survival is not incidental, Walsh said. And because the person who kept him alive under those conditions is someone we've been looking for, not to compel anything, not to pull you back into something you left, but because we need to understand who you are now and what you're doing here, and whether what happened in that trauma bay 3 days ago is something you're prepared to stand behind. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Someone told this hospital's administration about my service record, she said, before today. That's the only way Ashby could have structured his complaint in the way he did, framing my clinical interventions as aggression rather than advocacy. He knew I had a background I wasn't advertising. Walsh's expression didn't change, but she didn't deny it either. You think it was him? Mara asked. I think, Walsh said carefully, that there are things happening in this department that go beyond a personality conflict between a director and a nurse. And I think that if you've been in this hospital for 8 months watching what you've been watching, you already know that. Mara looked at her across the table. The dog looked at Mara. And somewhere on the floor above them, Raymond Ashby was in his glass-walled office, making a phone call that he believed would solve his problem before anyone could ask the wrong questions. He didn't know that someone had already started asking them. He didn't know that the woman he'd spent 8 months underestimating had kept records, had paid attention, had documented things quietly, carefully, with the precision of someone trained to operate in environments where details were the difference between surviving and not. He didn't know any of that. He was still operating on the assumption that she was just a nurse. The phone call Ashby was making lasted 6 minutes. Mara knew this because she had left the conference room 3 minutes before it ended. Walsh had given her a card, told her they'd be in Calverton for 48 hours, and let her go without pressure, without conditions, in the way of someone who understood that pressure wasn't the tool for this particular situation. And as she walked back through the administrative corridor toward the elevator, she passed close enough to Ashby's office to see him through the glass wall, phone against his ear, his back half turned and his free hand moving in the chopped, emphatic gestures of a man dictating terms to someone he believed was beneath him. She didn't stop. She kept walking, took the elevator up, and went back to work. She had 4 patients to check on. She checked on all 4. She updated a chart. She caught a junior nurse misreading a potassium result and corrected it without making it a lesson. She drank half a cup of coffee that had gone cold while sitting in the nurse's station. And she thought about 6 things at once with the focused compartmentalization that people who had never been in her specific kind of situation might have called detachment. It was not detachment. It was the opposite, a very complete and deliberately structured engagement with everything happening simultaneously, because the alternative was to let any one thing consume the others, and she couldn't afford that. She knew Ashby's call had been to the hospital's legal department. She knew because 22 minutes after she returned to the floor, she received a message through the internal system from the HR director, a woman named Patricia Gould, who communicated exclusively in carefully hedged institutional language, requesting that Mara report to her office at her earliest convenience to discuss professional conduct documentation. It was a fast move, faster than she'd expected, which told her that Ashby had either prepared for this specific contingency in advance, or that the legal department kept pre-drafted documentation templates for exactly this kind of situation. Neither possibility was reassuring. She messaged back that she'd come down at the end of her shift. Then she went and took a patient's blood pressure and wrote it down and moved on to the next room. Donna Oates found her again at 2:40 in the afternoon, and this time there was no preamble. "He's telling people you falsified the trauma record," Donna said. She'd followed Mara into the supply room and kept her voice low, though there was a quality to her quietness that wasn't quite calm. It was the low register of someone suppressing something larger. "From the Delaney case. He's telling the senior residents that you backdated your notes to make it look like you made the fast call before he did." Mara looked up from the supply shelf. "Who told you?" "Reese, the second year. He came to me because he was there and he knows it isn't true and he didn't know what to do with it." Donna pressed her mouth together briefly. "He's 26, Mara. He's scared of what happens if he contradicts an attending." "He should be scared," Mara said, not unkindly. "That's not an irrational response." "What are you going to do?" Mara considered the supply shelf in front of her. Gauze packs, adhesive tape, the orderly infrastructure of a system she'd been working inside for 8 months, learning its rhythms and its shortcuts and its specific varieties of dysfunction. She'd known from the beginning that it was temporary. She hadn't expected the end to come quite like this, but she hadn't expected it to last forever either. "I'm going to finish my shift," she said. Donna stared at her. "He's going to get you fired. He's going to try." She pulled the item she'd come for off the shelf and turned toward the door. "Donna, the resident, Reese, tell him not to sign anything Ashby puts in front of him without talking to legal counsel first. His own legal counsel, not the hospital's." Donna blinked. "You think he'd be asked to?" "I think Ashby is building a version of events, and building it requires signatures. Don't let the kids sign anything." She left the supply room. Behind her, she heard Donna exhale, a long, slow, pressurized sound, like something that had been held in for a considerable amount of time. The HR meeting with Patricia Gould lasted 38 minutes and accomplished nothing concrete, which was exactly what it was designed to do. Gould had a specific bureaucratic talent for presenting negative actions: suspension of duties, formal investigation initiation, the quiet stripping of access credentials, as neutral administrative processes, the way a dentist describes a root canal as a procedure. Routine. Necessary. Nothing personal. Mara sat across from her and listened to the language carefully. The words Gould used, the words she didn't use, the specific framing of each sentence. She was being placed on administrative leave pending a review of her conduct during the Delaney trauma response. The review would be conducted by an internal panel. Her access to patient records would be restricted during the investigation period. She was asked to surrender her badge reader at the end of the meeting. "How long?" Mara asked. "The review process typically takes 10 to 15 business days. Typically. These situations are individually assessed." Mara looked at her for a moment. Gould had the practiced composure of someone who had done this exact thing many times, delivered decisions that affected people's livelihoods while maintaining the affect of a woman discussing weather patterns. It wasn't cruelty. It was professionalism of a specific and depressing variety. "Has Dr. Ashby provided a formal statement?" Mara asked. "I'm not able to share the specifics of, has Dr. Park been contacted, the trauma surgeon who operated on the patient?" A brief pause. "The review will encompass all relevant parties. Has she been contacted?" Gould adjusted the folder in front of her. "I'm not in a position to confirm the status of individual." "No," Mara said. "She hasn't." She stood up. "I'd like the documentation of this meeting in writing by end of business today, including the specific conduct allegations and the names of the individuals who initiated the review request." Gould blinked. It was a small blink, but Mara caught it. The fractional recalibration of someone who had expected this to go a different way. Yes, that's your right." "Thank you," Mara said. She picked up her bag. "I'll return the badge reader at the security desk on the way out." She walked to the door, then stopped. "Patricia." She turned back. "Has anyone from Naval Special Warfare contacted this administration today? Regarding the Delaney case?" Another pause, longer this time. "I can't." "That's a yes," Mara said. "Thank you." She left. She drove home. She showered. She made food she didn't particularly taste and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the window without seeing anything outside it. Then she sat down at her kitchen table, a small, functional table she'd bought secondhand when she moved in, because buying new furniture had felt, at the time, like a kind of presumption. And she opened her laptop. She had a folder, not on the laptop. The laptop was for work that didn't require a paper trail. The folder was physical, stored in a waterproof sleeve inside a locked box under the bathroom sink, because she had a particular sense of irony and a legitimate appreciation for the obvious hiding place being, statistically, one of the better ones. She retrieved it, brought it to the table, and opened it. 8 months of documentation. Not dramatic. She wasn't the type to be dramatic about record keeping, which was the whole point. Dates, times, patient identifiers in compliance with privacy regulations, and the specific clinical decisions she had flagged, been overruled on, or been explicitly prevented from pursuing. Cross-referenced against outcomes. Because outcomes were the thing that didn't lie. Not like people could lie. Not like records could be retroactively adjusted if you knew which ones to watch. The missed aortic dissection, the blood type mismatch in the transfusion queue. 11 instances of documentation irregularities she'd caught in post-event chart review. 3 cases where patients had experienced adverse events that corresponded to clinical decisions made against nursing staff recommendations. Against her recommendations specifically in 2 of those 3 cases. She wasn't a lawyer, she wasn't an investigator, but she'd grown up understanding what evidence was. Not in the legal sense, in the practical sense. The kind of understanding that came from environments where the difference between what actually happened and what the official record said had immediate physical consequences. She knew what she had. She knew what it meant. She'd just been, for 8 months, very carefully not deciding what to do with it. She thought about Walsh's last statement in the conference room. There are things happening in this department that go beyond a personality conflict. Walsh knew, or suspected, or had heard something from Delaney that had prompted them to look more closely at Hartwell's ER records, and what they'd found had brought a JSOC representative to a regional hospital in Calverton over what could have been classified as a standard trauma consult. It wasn't a standard trauma consult. It had never been that. Mara closed the folder. She looked at her phone on the table next to her left hand. Walsh's card. The number on it. She picked up the phone. She set it down. She picked it up again. She dialed. Walsh answered on the second ring. "I have documentation," Mara said. 8 months of it. Clinical irregularities, outcome correlations, and what I believe are falsified entries in at least 6 patient records. Some of the irregularities may rise to a level that goes beyond administrative misconduct. A brief silence. "Are you in a secure location?" Mara looked around her kitchen, the window, the table, the folder. "I'm at home." "Can you come to us tonight? We're at the Calverton Harbor Inn, 3rd floor." "Yes." "Bring the documentation." Walsh paused. "Ms. Quinn, this wasn't a small thing you did in that trauma bay. I want you to know that. Whatever you think it was, whatever Ashby is trying to make it into, it wasn't small." Mara looked at the folder. "Marcus Delaney is alive." "Yes, among other things." She didn't know what that meant yet. She let it go for the moment. "I'll be there in an hour." She ended the call. She sat for exactly 45 seconds. Then she put the folder in a bag, put on her jacket, and left. The Calverton Harbor Inn was the kind of establishment that described itself as historic, and meant it, in the sense that nothing had been significantly renovated since approximately 1987. The lobby smelled like carpet shampoo and old wood, and the elevator moved with a meditative slowness that suggested it was doing its best. Walsh opened the door to room 312 before Mara knocked, which meant there was someone watching the hallway, which Mara registered without comment. Inside, Lieutenant Erickson was at a table covered in what appeared to be printed documents and a laptop. The K9, Colt, was in the corner on what appeared to be a portable mat, watching the door with the engaged stillness of a dog who did not consider himself off-duty. She laid out the folder on the table and walked them through it methodically. She was not nervous. She was past nervous, into something more functional than that. She explained what she'd observed, in what sequence, with what documentation, and she let the records speak in the flat, factual language that records spoke in when they were kept correctly. Walsh listened without interrupting. Erickson took notes. At one point, Erickson looked up from what he was writing and said, "This blood type case? Do you have the transfusion record?" "Copy of it, yes." He looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the table. Then she looked at Mara. "We requested Hartwell's ER records for the past 18 months yesterday as part of the Delaney case inquiry. They complied because they legally had to. We've had 2 people going through them today. She paused deliberately. We found 6 additional patient records with documentation inconsistencies. 3 of them involve outcomes. The room was quiet for a moment. He's been covering errors, Mara said. We believe so. And covering them in a way that's systematic enough to suggest it's been going on for longer than 18 months. Walsh's voice remained measured, but there was something underneath it now. A controlled gravity. This is no longer a question of administrative misconduct or a professional dispute between a director and a nurse. This is a patient safety issue with potential criminal dimensions, and it's now part of an active inquiry. Mara absorbed this. The administrative leave, we're aware of it. We made contact with Hartwell's administration this afternoon. Walsh paused, and something in her expression indicated that the contact had not gone entirely smoothly. Firm about the nature of our interest in the facility and in the individuals involved. Ashby knows you're looking at him. He knows something is happening. Whether he understands the full scope, probably not yet. Mara thought about the phone call she'd watched him make through the glass wall. The emphatic hand. The turned back. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years running a department in which no one adequately challenged him, and who had begun to believe the way people believe things when no one corrected them long enough. That being unchallenged meant being unchallengeable. He'll destroy what he can tonight, she said. Records he thinks are at risk. Documentation he can't revise cleanly. She looked at Walsh. How much do you already have secured? Walsh looked at Erickson. Erickson looked at Mara with something that might have been reassessment. We requested a litigation hold from hospital administration this afternoon. All records and electronic systems are frozen as of 4 p.m. Did Ashby know about the hold before 4 o'clock? A pause. Erickson's expression shifted slightly. That's a good question. It's a relevant one. She kept her voice even. If he had advance notice, even 30 minutes. We're pulling the electronic access logs, Walsh said. She was already picking up her phone. Erickson. Erickson was already at the laptop. Mara sat back and watched the 2 of them move into action with the particular economy of people who knew how to work quickly and didn't need to narrate it. The canine in the corner shifted on his mat, ears forward. She felt something that was not quite relief and not quite vindication. Something quieter than either of those, more practical. The sensation of a thing that had been suspended for 8 months finally, irrevocably, beginning to move. She was back in her apartment by 11. She slept 5 hours. Less than she wanted, more than she expected. She woke up to 2 messages. The first was from Donna Oates, sent at 6:47 a.m. There are investigators at the hospital, not hospital people, federal badges. Ashby hasn't come in. Nobody knows where he is. The second was from a number she didn't recognize, sent at 6:53 a.m. 10 words. You should know they found the hard thought you'd want to know. She stared at the second message for a long time. She didn't recognize the number. But the message was specific and accurate. Walsh and Erickson had been working on the access logs last night, and a hard delete of files from a restricted administrative account in the 90 minutes before the 4 p.m. litigation hold was exactly the kind of thing they would have found. The kind of thing that moved a case from suspected misconduct to evidence of cover-up. She didn't know who had sent the message. It could have been Erickson. It could have been someone else in the building last night who had access to the same information and a reason to make sure she knew. She saved the number. She got up, made coffee, and looked out the kitchen window at a morning that was overcast and flat and perfectly ordinary. Her phone rang. She answered without looking at the screen. Ms. Quinn. Walsh's voice was brisk, but underneath the efficiency there was something that had changed since last night, a different frequency. We need you back at the hospital this morning. There's been a development. The hard delete. A brief pause. You got that message? Yes. We'll talk about that when you get here, but that's not... The development isn't that. Another pause. Shorter, but weighted differently. Marcus Delaney is asking to speak with the hospital administration, formally, with a legal representative from Naval Special Warfare present. Walsh's voice was careful. And he's asking for you to be in the room. Mara set down her coffee cup. Why? Because he says there are things the administration needs to hear from someone who was there, Walsh said. And because he says the nurse who saved his life should be present when the record gets corrected. She paused one more time. He was pretty direct about it. Mara looked out the window. The overcast morning, the flat gray light, the unremarkable street outside an apartment she'd chosen because it was 3 miles from a hospital and had a month-to-month lease. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. She ended the call. She picked up her coffee again. She was halfway through it when another message arrived. This one from a number she'd seen in the hospital's internal system before, attached to an account she hadn't expected to contact her. Dr. Callum Reese, second-year resident, young, scared, standing in the middle of something he didn't have the architecture to navigate yet. The message said, "I wrote down everything I saw that night, the actual sequence. I have it. I don't know if it helps, but I thought you should know I have it." Mara read it twice. She typed back, "It helps. Don't delete it. Don't share it with anyone at the hospital. I'll tell you who to give it to." She sent it. She finished her coffee. She got dressed. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone rang a third time, and this time the number that came up on her screen made her stop. Not Walsh, not Donna, not Reese. It was the hospital's main administrative line. She answered, "Ms. Quinn." The voice was not Patricia Gould. It was male, tightly controlled, carrying the specific tension of a man who had spent the last 14 hours realizing that the situation he believed he was managing had been managing him all along. "This is Administrator Whitfield. We're requesting your presence this morning for an emergency administrative review." "I'm aware," she said. "Commander Walsh already called." A pause. "You've spoken with Commander Walsh?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. She could hear him recalibrating in real time, the particular sound of a man revising his assumptions about how much control he still had over the morning. There are several things that need to be addressed," Whitfield said, "regarding Dr. Ashby's department, and regarding the circumstances of your administrative leave, which we may need to revisit in light of—" "I'll be there at 8:30, Mara said. She hung up. She looked at her reflection in the dark window above the kitchen sink, a brief, functional glance, the kind she gave every morning without thinking about it. A 34-year-old woman in a jacket, car keys in one hand, a bag with 8 months of documentation in the other, preparing to walk back into a building that had spent 3 days trying to make her small. She turned away from the window. She was almost at the door when her phone buzzed one final time. Not a call, a message, from Walsh's number. "One more thing before you arrive. We ran Ashby's financial records as part of the inquiry authorization. He's been receiving consulting payments from a private medical auditing firm since 2021. The firm's primary client portfolio includes the liability insurance carriers for 3 hospitals in this region." A second line followed, arriving half a second after the first. He wasn't just covering errors. He was being paid to make the numbers look clean. Mara stood at her apartment door and read the message twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, letting the full shape of it settle. Not incompetence, not fear, not a man protecting himself from the consequences of his mistakes. Something colder than all of that. Something that had been operating underneath everything she'd seen for 8 months. Underneath the write-ups and the rotation removal and the bureaucratic machinery of a system that had been bending in a particular direction for a very long time. He had been paid to falsify, to manage, to make liability numbers look like acceptable loss. And she had been in his department, noticing, documenting, correcting for 8 months. And he had known. He had known she was a threat not because she was ambitious or aggressive or any of the things he'd called her. He had known because she was accurate, and accurate was the one thing the entire arrangement couldn't survive. She opened her apartment door. The hallway was empty, ordinary, fluorescent lit in the gray morning way of apartment building hallways everywhere. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. And somewhere across the city, in a hospital where federal investigators were reviewing access logs and a Navy commander was preparing a room, and a young resident was sitting with a piece of paper that documented the truth of a single night in careful, frightened handwriting. A man who had built a career on the assumption that the people beneath him would always stay beneath him was finally beginning to understand exactly what he had underestimated. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Mara stepped in. The elevator reached the ground floor at 7:44 a.m. and Mara walked to her car in the apartment complex lot with the particular focus of someone who has finished deciding and is now simply moving. The drive to Hartwell took 23 minutes. She took the long route, not to avoid anything, but because the longer route had fewer traffic signals and she needed the uninterrupted time to think without stopping. She ran through the sequence in her head the way she used to run pre-mission briefings, stripping each element to its essential facts and placing it in order. What was confirmed, what was probable, what was unknown and needed to be treated as a variable. Confirmed. Ashby had been receiving payments from an entity with financial interests in liability suppression. Walsh had documentation. That documentation would form the spine of whatever inquiry followed. Confirmed. The electronic access log showed a hard delete of files from a restricted account in the window before the litigation hold. Someone in the hospital, almost certainly Ashby, or someone acting on his instruction, had attempted to destroy records. The attempt had occurred after the litigation hold was announced, which made it obstruction. Probable. Ashby had not come in this morning. Whether he was aware of the full scope of what Walsh's team had uncovered, or whether he was simply running on instinct and the instinct was to disappear, she didn't know. Either way, his absence was its own kind of statement. Unknown how far this went. Whether it was one man managing his own exposure, or whether there were others in the administrative structure who had known, or looked away, or actively participated in what amounted to a long-running scheme built on harm that had been quietly reclassified as acceptable outcome variance. She parked in the hospital's visitor lot and sat in the car for 45 seconds with the engine off, looking at the building's main entrance. Then she got out and went in. The lobby was different from how she'd last seen it. Not physically. The same carpet, the same reception desk, the same institutional lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. But the population had shifted. Two people in suits near the administrative corridor moved with the quiet, systematic energy of federal investigators. A uniformed security officer stood near the elevator bank, looking uncomfortable in the particular way of someone whose job had just become significantly more complicated than expected. And at the reception desk, Bree, the morning coordinator who had always been uncomplicated in her friendliness toward Mara, was on the phone with the focused, slightly glassy expression of a person receiving instructions she was trying very hard to follow correctly. Commander Walsh was in the administrative conference room. Erickson was standing in the hallway outside it and nodded when he saw her, brief, functional, and held the door. Walsh was at the head of the table. Marcus Delaney was also in the room. He was in a wheelchair, which she'd understood logically but hadn't fully visualized. 5 days out of significant abdominal surgery, ambulation would be limited and painful. But he had clearly insisted on being here. That was visible in the set of his jaw and the careful, controlled way he held himself upright against discomfort he refused to name. He was in civilian clothes, dark shirt, jacket, and he looked like a man who had decided how he was going to show up and had prepared accordingly. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his expression adjusted, the same way it had in the recovery room. "You actually came," he said. "I said I would." People say a lot of things. Administrator Whitfield sat at the far end of the table, a compact man in his late 50s carrying the particular institutional exhaustion of administrators who had spent too long managing conflicts they hadn't caused. He looked like he hadn't slept. There was also a woman Mara didn't recognize. Mid-40s, precise posture, a laptop open in front of her, and a legal pad beside it. She introduced herself as Special Agent Renata Voss, Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. She said it without inflection, the way people say things they've said many times before, and she gestured toward the empty chair across from Delaney. Mara sat. The meeting began with Whitfield attempting to frame the proceedings as an internal review with federal oversight, which Voss corrected in 2 sentences by clarifying that OIG involvement transformed it into a federal inquiry under healthcare fraud statute, and that the distinction mattered because it determined who led the room. Voss led the room. She walked through the documented irregularities with methodical precision, not dramatically, not with the heightened language of accusation, but in the flat, relentless way of evidence presented by someone who does not need to perform certainty because they have it. 6 patient records. 3 adverse outcomes. The transfusion mismatch Mara had caught and corrected, subsequently documented in a way that removed her intervention entirely from the record. The aortic dissection case, where the patient had survived but initial documentation attributed the correct identification to the attending rather than the nursing staff who had caught it. Then the consulting payments. Walsh presented those. $48,000 over 3 years from a company called Meridian Clinical Partners. whose corporate structure, recently examined, revealed it as a subsidiary of a liability management firm whose clients included the insurers covering Hartwell Regional. Whitfield's face moved through a sequence of expressions Mara tracked without appearing to watch. Genuine shock first. Then something harder to read. Not guilt, but the particular discomfort of a man realizing that things had happened in his building that he should have seen and didn't. "I need to be clear," Whitfield said when Walsh paused. "I had no knowledge of any financial relationship between Dr. Ashby and any external entity." "We're aware of that," Voss said. "Your financial disclosures have been reviewed. You're not a subject of this inquiry." Whitfield absorbed this with the complicated relief of a man told he's not in trouble while standing in the room where someone else's trouble is being fully unpacked. "Where's Ashby?" Mara asked. Walsh looked at her. "He's been located. He's at his residence. An agent is present. He knows. He knows something is happening. The full scope. Probably not yet." Delaney spoke from across the table. His voice was quieter than it had been in the recovery room. The effort of sitting upright was costing him, though he wouldn't show it directly. "I want to say something for the record." Voss looked at him. "Go ahead." "I've been in combat environments on 4 continents. I know what it looks like when someone makes a call under pressure and gets it right. What happened in that trauma bay when I came in was not a nurse following protocol. That was a trained specialist recognizing a hemorrhagic pattern and acting on it before the attending physician had finished forming an opinion." He looked at Walsh. "I don't say that to diminish anyone. I say it because the record apparently shows something different, and the record is wrong." "The record will be corrected," Voss said. "I know. I want it stated clearly." He shifted in the wheelchair, and the movement cost him something he absorbed quietly. "She saved my life. The record should reflect that without qualification." The room was quiet for a moment. Mara looked at the surface of the conference table, not away from discomfort, just letting the moment exist without filling it. The formal portion ended at 10. Voss stayed with Whitfield. Walsh stepped out to take a call. Erickson appeared with Delaney's physical therapist, a young woman who had been waiting in the hallway for 90 minutes and who looked at Delaney's posture with the professional disapproval of someone who knows exactly how much pain the man in front of her has been managing and for how long. "I need another 10 minutes, Delaney told her. "You've been upright for 2 hours. 10 minutes. She left without agreeing, which was the negotiating position of someone who knew she'd already lost. When the room was down to the 2 of them, Delaney looked at her. "You knew before Walsh called you, about the payments." "I suspected something systematic, not the mechanism. But you kept records anyway." "Yes." "For 8 months. He paused. "Why didn't you go to the State Medical Board, or OIG directly?" "Because I needed more than suspicion, and because I needed to understand whether it was one person or a system before pointing at a target." She kept her voice even. "If you report one man and the structure survives, you've only solved part of the problem. And if you wait too long gathering evidence, people get hurt." "Yes," she said. "I know." The acknowledgement sat between them. She didn't qualify it. He didn't push. "Mahad Province," he said. 2017. "My unit had been in that village for 11 hours when the vehicles were hit. 3 men who needed surgical intervention within the hour, or they weren't going home. The extraction bird was 22 minutes out." He stopped. "You came in through the north side of the building. There was still contact from 2 directions. You triaged all 3 casualties in under 4 minutes, set up a functional surgical field in a building with no power, no sterile environment, active ballistic risk, kept all 3 alive until the follow-on bird was clear." He looked at her steadily. "One of those men has 3 kids now. Another one is in medical school. He decided he wanted to be a doctor after watching what you did that night." Mara said nothing. "I never knew your name," Delaney said. "The record showed voluntary transition 3 months after Mahad. No forwarding contact, gone." A pause. "I've been looking for a long time." "You found someone else," Mara said. "In that trauma bay. Not the same person." "Close enough. I'm a nurse. I work in a hospital. That's what I am now." "Okay," he said. The same word as before, the same tone. Not agreement, not argument. Something more like patience. His therapist reappeared. He turned toward her, then looked back at Mara one more time. Whatever happens next, the hearings, the inquiry, you'll be asked to give a formal statement about what you witnessed here, about your clinical observations. He held her gaze. Don't minimize it. The people in that folder you've been carrying deserve the full version. She looked at him for a moment. You sound very certain about what I should do. I'm certain about what's right. He said it without apology. I know you've spent years being careful about not being visible. I'm not telling you it's easy. The therapist made a sound in the doorway. He started to move the wheelchair. One more thing. Reese, the resident, tell him to give his documentation directly to Voss, and tell him it gets easier after the first step. A brief pause. That's actually true. He left. Mara sent Reese the message. Then she sat alone in the conference room for 30 seconds, looking at the table. The next 4 hours moved the way consequential administrative proceedings moved, slowly in some stretches, with sudden acceleration in others. Voss and her team worked through the records department. Walsh coordinated with administration on emergency staffing. And at 11:47, Erickson came to find Mara in the 4th floor nursing lounge and said, "The hard delete. We recovered most of it." She looked up from her coffee. Standard overwrite protocol, but the backup servers run a 72-hour rolling archive he apparently didn't know about. We got 91% of the deleted files. He had the controlled energy of someone who finds forensic recovery professionally satisfying. 11 additional patient records. 4 show direct alteration to remove documented nursing concerns before they reached attending review. Your name is on 3 of those as the originating flag. He deleted my flags and closed the cases before the flag was processed, which means they don't appear in the hospital's reportable event log. The insurers never see them. She thought about what that meant concretely, not abstractly. Each flag she'd entered and watched disappear into administrative silence had represented a specific patient who came to the hospital needing help, and in at least some of those cases, had been harmed in ways that were then actively concealed from the people whose job was to prevent future harm. Who else knew? She asked. That's what we're working on. He paused. The financial trail is pretty well contained to Ashby, but the administrative culture that allowed it, not questioning him, not reporting upward, not pushing back, that's more distributed. Institutional complicity. That's a diplomatic way to put it. He met her eyes. You flagged it, repeatedly, through channels. And the system processed your flags as disciplinary issues rather than clinical concerns. That's going to be part of the inquiry record. He left. She sat with it. Not with anger. She'd had 8 months for anger and spent it efficiently, channeled into documentation rather than noise, because noise accomplished nothing in systems designed to absorb it. What she sat with now was the particular exhaustion of a long-sustained effort approaching its conclusion, combined with the awareness that conclusion was not the same as resolution. The patients who had been harmed. The 3 adverse outcomes. She did not know yet what had become of those 3 people, whether the harm was temporary or permanent, whether they'd recovered or carried it still. She would know eventually. The inquiry would surface it. She did not want to know and could not look away from the necessity of knowing. Both things were true simultaneously, and she held them both. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Ashby came in. Not the way she would have predicted. She'd expected, if he came at all, the posture of a man maintaining his authority performance as armor. What walked through the hospital's main entrance, flanked by a personal attorney with an OIG agent following at a precise and unambiguous distance, was a man who had made a calculation overnight and arrived at a specific decision about how to play it. He looked diminished, not broken. She didn't think Raymond Ashby was the type to break in any observable way, but reduced, the way things were reduced when you stripped their context. He had been a powerful man inside a specific environment, and the environment had shifted, and without it, he was a 51-year-old physician in a good suit managing consequences he had not believed would catch him. She watched from the 4th floor nursing station. He did not look up. His attorney spoke briefly with Voss at the entrance to the administrative corridor. 3 minutes. Then Ashby was escorted, carefully, procedurally, with the choreography of a process arranged in advance, toward the conference room Voss had been using all morning. Donna appeared beside Mara at the station. She had clearly been watching from a different angle. He came in, Donna said quietly. Yes. I didn't think he would. His attorney told him to. You can't manage a narrative you're absent from. Mara kept her voice low. He's going to try to minimize his role, frame the payments as legitimate consulting, argue the record alterations were administrative corrections, not intentional falsification. A pause. Will it work? No, but he doesn't know the full scope of what they've recovered yet. Donna was quiet for a moment, watching the conference room door from a distance. Then, Mara, the staff down there in the ER, most of them didn't know what he was doing. They went along. They didn't ask questions. I know. Does that make them responsible? Mara thought about it honestly, because Donna was asking honestly and deserved that. It makes them part of a system that produced harm. Whether it makes them legally or individually responsible depends on what they knew and when. But, she paused. Complicity isn't always active. Sometimes it's just the choice not to look too closely. That choice has a cost too. It just usually gets paid by someone else. Donna absorbed this. She looked tired in the way of someone processing not just information but implication. The backward-looking realization of what proximity to this had made her part of, even without knowledge, even without intention. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Donna said quietly, "You have 3 kids and a mortgage, and you work in a department run by a man who ended careers when it suited him. That's not an excuse." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not. But it's a reason. They're different things." Donna nodded. Once, slow, the nod of someone filing something away in a permanent place. The afternoon ground forward. At 2:30, Voss requested Mara's formal statement. Not the documentation she'd already provided, but a recorded verbal account, methodical and specific, covering every clinical incident she had flagged, every instance of record alteration she had subsequently identified, every conversation with Ashby that was relevant to the pattern of conduct under investigation. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. She spoke the way she had been trained to speak in high-stakes debriefs, clearly, sequentially, without embellishment, without the softening qualifications that people sometimes inserted to make themselves sound less certain than they were. She was certain. She had documentation. She cited it by date, by patient identifier, by the specific discrepancy between what she had observed and what the record subsequently showed. At one point, partway through her account of the Delaney trauma response, Voss paused the recording and said, "I want to confirm something. At the time you assessed the need for direct OR transfer, you had been informed by Dr. Ashby that you were being removed from the trauma rotation." "I'd been informed of the rotation change approximately 72 hours earlier, yes." "And you proceeded anyway?" "The patient was hemorrhaging." Voss looked at her for a moment across the recorder. "I just wanted that in the record," she said, and restarted the recording. When it was done, Mara walked out into the corridor and stood near the window at the end of the hallway. The late afternoon light was coming in at an angle that turned the linoleum floor into something almost warm, which was not something she had noticed before in 8 months of walking these floors. She stood there for a full minute, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting her nervous system register that the effort of the last 3 hours had concluded. Then her phone rang. Walsh. "We have a problem," Walsh said. Mara turned from the window. "What happened?" "Ashby's attorney submitted a formal counter-allegation 20 minutes ago, targeting you specifically." Walsh's voice was controlled but moving faster than usual. "He's alleging that your interventions in the Delaney case constituted unauthorized practice of medicine and that your service record, which he now apparently has access to, demonstrates a pattern of operating outside sanctioned boundaries in military contexts as well." A pause. "He's also alleging that your documentation was fabricated post hoc to build a false case against his client." Mara was quiet for a moment. "He got my service record. Redacted version, but enough. Someone provided it to his attorney." "When?" "The filing timestamp is 2:17 p.m. She thought about this. "He prepared that before he came in this morning." "Yes." "Which means he came in planning to cooperate on the surface while his attorney filed a preemptive counter on his behalf. Two-track strategy." She kept her voice steady. "He came in to see what we had." "That's what I think, yes." Walsh's pause had weight to it. "Mara, the counter-allegation creates a procedural complication. It doesn't change the evidentiary foundation, but it creates a basis for Ashby's attorney to argue that this inquiry is retaliatory, that you orchestrated a federal investigation to deflect from your own conduct violations. That's absurd. It's also potentially effective as a delay tactic. If the inquiry gets slowed by a counter-allegation review, the timeline extends. Evidence gets challenged. Witnesses get fatigued. Walsh paused. There's something else. The allegation about your service record, specifically your role in the Mahad operation. It characterizes certain decisions you made in the field as violations of medical protocol under emergency conditions. Mara said nothing. It's reaching, Walsh said. The characterization is deeply unfair and I believe it's factually incorrect. But the attorney is clearly banking on the idea that you won't want your service record open to public scrutiny, that you'll back off the statement you gave this afternoon to avoid it. The hallway was quiet. Down at the far end, two nurses passed in conversation, their voices faint and ordinary. He misjudged, Mara said. I believe so. But I need to know. Are you willing to let us respond to the counter-allegation fully? That means your service record becomes part of the inquiry record. The Mahad operation. All of it. She thought about 8 years. The careful construction of an ordinary life, the month-to-month lease, the second-hand table, the apartment chosen for its proximity to a hospital, and the ease of leaving. The deliberate smallness of it, which she had told herself was peace, and which she now understood had also been, at least in part, concealment. She thought about the 3 men from Mahad, one with 3 kids, one in medical school. She thought about the patient whose blood type had nearly been wrong. Yes, she said. Let them open it. Walsh was briefly quiet. Okay. There's one more thing. Ashby is still in the conference room with Voss. His attorney received the counter-allegation confirmation, and Ashby knows it was filed. And Walsh stopped. What? He's requesting to speak with you directly. Without attorneys, without Voss. Just you and him. A pause. He says he'll tell you something about the department that isn't in any record and that you need to know. He says it changes the scope of the inquiry. Mara stared at the window. The afternoon light had shifted while she was on the phone, the warmth gone out of the linoleum floor. He's trying to make a deal, she said. Almost certainly. But Voss thinks there may be something real in it. The way he said it, she thinks he's not entirely manufacturing. There may be something he held back that his attorney told him to deploy if the situation became critical. Walsh's voice was precise and careful. It's your call. You don't have to go in there. The hallway was very quiet. Mara thought about what Walsh had said about Ashby's financial arrangements. The liability management firm, the $48,000, the corporate structure that had taken Walsh's team effort to trace. That structure existed because someone had built it. And a man like Ashby, smart enough to maintain that arrangement for 3 years without detection, was not the kind of man who operated without understanding the full architecture of what he was embedded in. There was something else. She had known it, or felt the outline of it, for months. The sense that what she was documenting was the visible edge of something larger, that Hartwell's dysfunction was not unique to Hartwell, that the liability management firm whose subsidiary paid Ashby had other clients, other hospitals, other departments where someone was performing the same careful management of harm. But there was something he hadn't given Voss. If there was a piece of the structure she didn't have yet. I'll go in, she said. A pause. I'll have Erickson outside the door, and we'll be monitoring. I know. She ended the call. She stood at the window for 4 more seconds, looking at the parking lot below. Ordinary afternoon, ordinary cars, the flat light of early evening beginning to gray the edges of things. Then she walked toward the conference room. The door was closed. Through the narrow glass panel beside it, she could see Ashby sitting at the table, alone, no attorney, no Voss, as he'd requested. He was not looking at the door. He was looking at his hands on the table in front of him, and something about his posture in the absence of an audience had changed. The performance was down. What was left was just a man sitting with the weight of what he'd done, or at least the weight of being caught doing it, which was a different thing but had the same gravity. She put her hand on the door. She opened it. He looked up when she came in. His face moved through something she couldn't immediately name. Not quite relief, not quite dread. Something between them. "Close the door," he said. She did. She sat down across from him, not at the end of the table, not performing distance. directly across. Close enough to see his face clearly, far enough that nothing about the arrangement was ambiguous. He looked at her for a long moment. His voice, when he spoke, was stripped of the careful authority she'd heard for 8 months. Stripped of everything, really, down to something that was just a man talking. "Hartwell isn't the only one," he said. The room was very still. "Meridian Clinical Partners," he said. "They have contracts with 4 other regional hospitals in this state. And I know who runs the program at 2 of them." He put both hands flat on the table. "I have names. I have documentation I didn't give the OIG agent, and I will give all of it, everything, in exchange for a specific arrangement regarding my cooperation status." He paused. "But I'll only give it through you, not through Walsh, not through Voss." His eyes steadied on her face. "Because you're the one who built the case that got me here. And you're the one person in this building who will understand what it means." She looked at him across the table. Outside the conference room door, she knew Erickson was standing in the hallway. She knew Walsh was listening through a device she'd been handed before walking in. She knew Voss was 3 rooms away and would be in this room within 4 minutes of a signal. She did not signal, not yet. "Show me," she said. And Ashby reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and put a USB drive on the table between them. The USB drive sat on the table between them like a small, ugly fact. Mara didn't reach for it. She looked at it, then at Ashby, and she read his face the way she'd learned to read faces in environments where misreading them had immediate physical consequences. He was scared, genuinely, in the way that people were scared when they had finally run out of the room they'd been maneuvering in. But underneath the fear there was something else, something she hadn't expected. Not remorse exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who had been performing a version of himself for a very long time and had just stopped. "When did you put that together?" she asked. 3 years ago. He looked at the drive, not at her. Not all at once. It accumulated. Names, dates, the internal communications from Meridian that I wasn't supposed to retain. His voice had the flat quality of something pre-rehearsed, but not in the way of a lie. In the way of someone who has said something to themselves so many times in private that saying it aloud produces a kind of numbness. "I kept it because I knew eventually I'd need it." "You kept it as insurance?" "Yes. And now the insurance is due." He looked up at her. "I know what you think of me. What I think of you isn't relevant to this conversation." "No," he said, "but I want to say it anyway. When I started at this hospital, I wasn't what I became here." He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "I don't expect that to mean anything to you." "It doesn't change the patients," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "No, it doesn't." He looked at his hands on the table. 3 of the hospitals in the Meridian network, 2 in this state, 1 across the border in Vance County. They're running the same program. Modified error reclassification, liability outcome management, compensation suppression. The man who runs the program for Meridian is named Gerald Pratt. He's not a physician, he's an actuary. He designed the protocol and recruited the department heads who would implement it. Ashby's voice had gone very flat and precise. "I can give you the recruitment conversation, audio." Mara looked at him. "You recorded him." "I recorded everything from the 2nd year forward, because I understood by then what I was in, and I needed a way out that didn't destroy me completely." He glanced at the drive. "That's not everything on there. There's also the original protocol document, the one Pratt uses to onboard new department heads. It details exactly how the reclassification system works, which record fields to modify, how to structure documentation to survive an internal audit." She said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about the shape of what he was describing. Not one man running a bad department, but a designed system, built by someone who understood actuarial risk well enough to construct a framework that was almost invisible until you were inside it, and looking at the individual cases and seeing the pattern underneath. She was also thinking about the fact that she was sitting in a room with a man who had spent 3 years contributing to that system while retaining the evidence to leverage his way out of it, and that the 2 things were not separable from each other, no matter how tired or diminished he looked right now. "You kept recording and kept complying," she said. "Yes." "At the same time?" "Yes." He didn't look away. "I know what that is." "Do you?" A long pause. "It's cowardice," he said, "with an escape plan built into it." He exhaled. I told myself it was survival, that I'd use the recordings when the time was right. The time kept not being right. Until now, when being caught made it right. He absorbed that without flinching. Yes. She reached across the table and picked up the drive. She looked at it in her hand for a moment. Small, unremarkable. The kind of object that got lost in desk drawers and jacket pockets, in the accumulated material clutter of ordinary life. She thought about the weight of what was on it. Not literally, because digitized audio and documents had no physical weight, but in the other sense. The weight of what it represented in terms of people harmed, claims suppressed, stories that had been administratively erased before anyone with authority to act on them had a chance to read them. She stood up. She knocked twice on the conference room door. Erickson opened it. She held out the drive to him. "Get Voss," she said, "and record everything he says from this point forward." She glanced back at Ashby. "He has names." She walked out into the hallway. Walsh was 40 feet down the corridor, phone down, watching Mara come toward her with the expression of someone who has been listening and is now recalibrating the size of what she's working with. "Gerald Pratt," Mara said when she reached her. "Actuary. Runs the Meridian program. Ashby has audio of the recruitment conversation and what sounds like the operational protocol document." She kept her voice low and even. "It's bigger than Hartwell." Walsh was quiet for 2 seconds. "How much bigger?" "At minimum, 3 additional hospitals. Possibly more if Pratt has been running this for longer than Ashby's been in it." She paused. "The counter-allegation Ashby's attorney filed this afternoon. He agreed to that before he came in, but I don't think he intended to go all the way with it. It was a bargaining chip to make sure he had something to trade. He's been managing his exit for a while. He played both sides this morning. He played every side he could identify. That's how he's operated for 3 years." She looked at Walsh steadily. "He's not going to get the deal he wants. But if what's on that drive is what he says it is, the OIG will want to know what he knows about the other facilities before anyone decides what his cooperation is worth." Walsh nodded. She was already pulling up her phone. "I need to loop in the regional OIG office. This goes beyond Voss's initial scope." She looked at Mara. "You were right to go in there. I thought there was something he was holding." "There was." Walsh paused, her phone halfway to her ear. "He asked specifically for you. Why do you think that was?" Mara considered it. "Because I'm the person who built the case that exposed him, and he needed to demonstrate he was giving me something I couldn't get any other way. It's a respect play. He wanted the exchange to mean something." She paused. "He also thought I might be more willing to advocate for a specific cooperation arrangement than Voss would be, because I have a personal stake in the outcome." "Was he right?" She thought about it honestly. "About the personal stake, yes. About it changing how I handled the situation, no." Walsh looked at her for a moment. Then she made the call. "What?" The rest of the afternoon moved with a new velocity. Voss came out of the records department at 4:20 and went directly into the conference room with Ashby, and the meeting that followed lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. Erickson worked the drive in a separate room, pulling files and confirming content against what Ashby was describing verbally, and at 6:15 he came to find Walsh and Mara in the administrative break room, which had become, by default, their working space, and sat down and opened his laptop and turned it so they could both see the screen. "The audio is real," he said. "We ran a preliminary analysis. The metadata is consistent with the recording date Ashby provided, and the second voice matches publicly available recordings of Gerald Pratt. He's testified before state insurance committees twice. There's archived audio." He pulled up a transcript. "The recruitment conversation is explicit. Pratt walks Ashby through the reclassification protocol step by step, and specifically discusses how to handle nursing staff who flag discrepancies." Mara looked at the transcript. She found the relevant section within 15 seconds. "The issue with nursing staff is almost always the same. They're too close to the patient-level data, and they flag things that don't need to be flagged. The way you manage it is through the performance review system. Flag the flaggers, document them as problematic before they can document you. By the time anyone takes their concerns seriously, their credibility is already compromised." She read it twice. She set the laptop down. The break room was very quiet. "He designed that," she said. It wasn't a question. Pratt designed the entire protocol. The documentation system, the performance management approach, the liability routing. Erickson's voice was steady, but with something underneath it. Controlled anger, she thought. The kind that competent people felt when they saw competence deployed toward something that harmed people. Ashby was an implementer. A willing one, but an implementer. How long has Pratt been running this? Based on the documents on the drive, at least 7 years. Possibly longer. He paused. Hartwell isn't even his most significant account. There's a hospital in the northern part of the state, Clearview Medical Center, where the reclassification volume is 3 times what it was here. The adverse outcome rate in their ER over the past 5 years is statistically inconsistent with their reported incident rate. He looked at Mara. Someone has been suppressing a lot of data at Clearview for a long time. She thought about patients she didn't know, in a hospital she'd never been to, who had come in needing help and whose harm had been processed into a spreadsheet and disappeared. She thought about the nurses at Clearview who had probably flagged things, who had probably been documented as problematic before their concerns could be taken seriously. Pratt needs to be a federal target, she said. He will be, Walsh said. This goes to the FBI's healthcare fraud unit tomorrow morning. The OIG doesn't have the jurisdictional reach for a multi-state operation at this scale. She looked at Voss, who had slipped into the break room at some point in the last 2 minutes with the quiet arrival of someone accustomed to entering rooms without disrupting them. Renata. Voss set her legal pad on the table and sat down. The cooperation agreement with Ashby is going to be complicated, she said. He's been an active participant in a scheme that caused demonstrable harm to patients over a 3-year period. The counter-allegation his attorney filed this afternoon doesn't help his posture. She looked at Mara. He'll get some credit for the drive and the audio. He won't walk away from criminal exposure. What he might get, depending on how useful his testimony is in building the Pratt case, is a reduced charge profile and sentencing consideration. That feels insufficient, Mara said. It often does. Voss said it without apology. It's also how large criminal networks get prosecuted. You make deals with the people inside to get the people running it. She paused. The alternative is Ashby exercises his rights, cooperates with nothing, and Pratt takes another 3 years to build a case against through external investigation alone, during which time the program continues operating at Clearview and the other facilities. Mara understood this. She didn't like it, which was separate from understanding it. What about Hartwell specifically? She asked. The patients here, the 3 adverse outcomes in the flagged cases. Civil liability for the hospital is significant. The institution will almost certainly face regulatory action, substantial financial penalties, and mandatory oversight. Individual patients or their families will be notified and will have civil remedies available. Voss held her gaze. It's not nothing. I know it's not nothing. But it's not the same as undoing harm. No, Mara said. It isn't. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the break room window, the parking lot lights had come on, dusk arriving the way it did in late fall, abruptly, without the long transition of summer evenings. At 7:40 p.m., the administrative leave against Mara was formally rescinded. Whitfield delivered this in person, coming to the break room with the careful posture of a man who understood that the situation required him to do this correctly and was genuinely uncertain whether anything he said would be adequate to it. He handed her a letter, a single page, formal letterhead, and stood with his hands clasped in front of him while she read it. The letter was bureaucratically thorough. It rescinded the administrative leave, withdrew the conduct allegations, confirmed that her clinical actions in the Delaney trauma case were consistent with appropriate nursing practice, and indicated that she was free to return to work in whatever capacity she chose. She folded it, put it in her bag. The complaints Ashby filed against me, she said, over the past 8 months. I want those formally reviewed and removed from my personnel record. Yes, Whitfield said immediately. Absolutely. We'll initiate that process. Not initiated, completed. I want written confirmation of their removal within 5 business days. He nodded. He looked like a man who had decided that whatever Mara Quinn asked for in the next several days, the correct answer was yes. There's also the question of the nursing staff in the ER, she said. The ones who flagged concerns that were processed through Ashby's performance management system. If their records showed disciplinary actions connected to clinical concerns they raised, those need to be reviewed and corrected as well. She paused. Not just mine. Whitfield blinked. He hadn't thought about the others. She could see it in his face. The recognition that his focus had been on the most visible situation and that there was a larger pattern he hadn't mapped yet. "I'll need a list," he said. "I have one," Mara said. "I've had it for 4 months." She sent it to his email from her phone while he stood there. 11 names. Nurses, a respiratory therapist, one radiology tech who had documented a concern about a contrast study that Ashby had subsequently reclassified. 11 people who had done their jobs and been penalized for it. Whitfield looked at his phone. He looked at her. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand the actual scope of what had been happening in his hospital, and who was finding it significantly larger than he had estimated. He left. Donna appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, which meant she had been in the corridor and had heard at least the end of the conversation. 11 people, she said, that I documented. There may be more. Mara looked at her. Were you on the list? Donna was quiet for a moment. No, I never formally flagged anything. I know. A pause. The weight of that acknowledgement sat between them. Not accusatory, just accurate. Donna had been in the ER for 22 years and had developed the survival strategy of not formally documenting the things she privately knew to be wrong. And that strategy had protected her career and had also meant that she appeared on no lists, in no records, as someone who had tried to push back. I should have been on it, Donna said. Probably, Mara said. But you're not. And what matters now is what happens going forward. She looked at her steadily. The ER is going to need people who know how it actually works. Not just the paperwork version, the real version. Donna nodded slowly. Is that your way of saying you're coming back? Mara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the window, at the dark parking lot outside, at her own partial reflection in the glass. Functional, tired, present. I don't know yet, she said. Let me get through tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived early and moved fast. The OIG's formal referral to the FBI's healthcare fraud unit was filed at 9:12 a.m. By 10:30, Mara had received a call from an FBI agent named Tomas Reyna, who was professionally courteous and efficiently thorough, and who asked her to come in for a supplemental interview at the federal building downtown at 1 p.m. She went. The interview lasted 2 hours. She answered every question completely and brought copies of her documentation, which Reyna received with the careful attention of a man who had been hoping for exactly this kind of organized evidentiary record. On the way out of the federal building, she ran into Erickson in the lobby, apparently finishing his own session upstairs. Pratt, she said, being looked at as of this morning. His attorneys don't know yet. Erickson looked tired in the functional way of someone who had been working for 36 hours but was not going to mention it. The other facilities, OIG has already made contact with state health departments in both states. It's moving. How long before it becomes public? The Hartwell part? Probably 2-3 days. The state health department has to notify, the hospital has to make disclosures. The Pratt investigation will take longer. They'll keep that contained while they build. She nodded. Reese, she said, the resident. He gave a statement? Yesterday afternoon. Voss said he was nervous but thorough. His written account corroborated your sequence of events in the Delaney case completely. Erickson paused. Voss said he cried a little bit in the middle and then kept going. Mara thought about a 26-year-old standing in the middle of something too large for him, writing down what he actually saw, because someone told him it would get easier after the first step. He'll be okay, she said. Yeah. Erickson looked at her for a moment. For what it's worth, the counter-allegation Ashby's attorney filed, the one targeting your service record. He paused. Walsh is personally addressing it. She's filed a formal response on behalf of Naval Special Warfare that it's pretty direct. She documented the Mahad operation with declassified materials and characterized Ashby's attorney's representation of your actions as, and I'm quoting, factually unsupported and professionally irresponsible. Mara said nothing for a moment. I didn't ask her to do that. No, she did it because she wanted to. He held her gaze briefly. The characterization of what you did in that building, that you violated medical protocol. She wasn't going to let that stand in a federal record. Neither was Delaney, for that matter. He submitted a written account of the operation, voluntarily, without being asked. She looked at the lobby floor. The federal building lobby was all marble in height, designed to communicate the weight of institutions, not her natural environment. She'd always found large government buildings slightly airless. "Thank you," she said, to Erickson, because he'd been the one to tell her, and because she meant it generally. He nodded once and left. The public disclosure came in 41 hours, which was faster than Erickson had estimated. Hartwell Regional issued a statement on a Thursday afternoon acknowledging an ongoing federal inquiry into the hospital's emergency department, confirming that Dr. Raymond Ashby had been removed as ER director effective immediately, and stating that the hospital was cooperating fully with all relevant authorities. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and said nothing specific about what had been found, which was legally appropriate and which meant that the local news outlets filled in the gaps with what they had, which was enough. The regional paper ran the story the next morning. Ashby's name. The federal inquiry. The reference to a whistleblower whose documentation had initiated the investigation, unnamed as Mara had specifically requested in writing before the disclosure went out. It didn't stay unnamed for long. By Friday afternoon, Mara had 7 messages from journalists. She responded to none of them. She had 2 messages from former colleagues at other facilities she'd worked at before Hartwell. People who had heard the story through the networks that medical professionals maintained. The informal circulation of information that moved faster than any formal communication channel. She responded to those briefly because the people who sent them deserved acknowledgement. She had 1 message from a number she didn't recognize that turned out, when she ran it, to be a nurse at Clearview Medical Center, the facility Erickson had identified as Pratt's most significant account. The message said, "I've been keeping records for 2 years. I didn't know who to send them to. Can I send them to you?" She stared at that message for a long time. Then she forwarded it to Voss with a note. "You should call this person today." She sat in her apartment and looked at her phone and thought about the structural reality of what was unfolding. Ashby was cooperating within the terms that Voss and the FBI were negotiating. The deal he'd wanted hadn't materialized exactly as he'd hoped, but he was talking, and what he was providing was enough to significantly accelerate the Pratt investigation. The protocol document on the drive had already been authenticated and was being used to identify the specific record modification signatures across multiple hospital systems, a forensic accounting of harm that was going to take months to fully trace. Gerald Pratt had hired 3 attorneys as of Thursday. His company's assets had been flagged. He had not yet been charged with anything because the federal case was being built carefully, but the architecture was collapsing around him, and the people who had been inside it were making calculations about what cooperation was worth. It was not a clean resolution, it was not fast, and it would not be complete for a long time, and the people who had been harmed would have to navigate a legal system that was thorough but slow, and which would make them tell their stories multiple times in multiple rooms before anything final was determined. None of that was what anyone would have chosen, but the thing was moving. After years of being managed into silence, the thing was finally moving. She went back to the hospital on Saturday. Not to work. She hadn't made that decision yet. She went because Delaney was being discharged, and he'd left a message through Walsh asking if she'd come. She wasn't sure why she was going, or rather she was sure but was examining the reasons carefully, because she'd learned that unexamined certainty was how people made mistakes. She went because he'd asked, because he was a person she respected, which was not a common enough occurrence that she could afford to dismiss it, and because there was something unfinished in the space between what had happened in the trauma bay and what had happened since, something that needed a proper close before it could be filed away. The discharge process took longer than it should have, because hospital discharge processes always took longer than they should have. This was universal, impervious to reform, and had nothing to do with anything except the volume of paperwork that attended the movement of one human being from institutional care back into the world. She waited in the corridor outside his room and read messages on her phone and talked briefly with his physical therapist, who confirmed that his recovery prognosis was excellent, and who said this with the satisfied authority of someone who had made sure of it personally. When he came out in the wheelchair, still not walking independently, which would take another 2 weeks, he was in the same civilian clothes he'd worn to the conference room, which meant someone had brought them, which meant he had planned this. He looked better than he had on Monday. Not well. He was 5 days out of major surgery, and it would be months before he was fully recovered, but present and focused, which was its own kind of health. His canine, Colt, was with him. Apparently the dog had been at a handler facility and had been brought in for the discharge, because some things required the full unit. Colt sat beside the wheelchair with his vest on and his attention fully operational, and when Mara came into his line of sight, his ears came up and he tracked her with the comprehensive assessment she'd observed in the hospital lobby. "He likes you," Delaney said. "He's evaluating me." "With Colt, that's the same thing." He looked at her. "Thank you for coming." "You asked." "I didn't know if that was enough." She looked at him. It was enough. They moved toward the elevator and she walked beside the wheelchair with the unhurried pace of two people who were not trying to perform a moment, but were simply occupying one. In the elevator, she watched the floor numbers, and he watched the doors, and Colt watched everything. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet. Walsh told me they've offered you a consulting role, formal relationship with the OIG's investigation." She mentioned it. "You haven't said yes." "I haven't said anything yet." She paused. "I'm not a federal investigator." "No, but you know what to look for. And apparently there are nurses at other facilities who are looking for someone to send their records to." He said it without pressure, just as a statement of fact. "You built an 8-month evidentiary record while working full-time in a department run by someone actively trying to undermine you. That's a skill set. That's a very specific way to describe what I did for 8 months. I'm a specific person." He glanced at her. "You could also just go back to nursing, somewhere else. Start over. That's a legitimate choice." "I know it is. But?" She looked at the elevator doors. "But the nurse at Clearview has 2 years of records she didn't know who to send them to. And there are probably others." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "There probably are." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. They crossed the lobby, Colt's nails on the marble, the wheelchair's soft roll, the ordinary noise of a hospital in midday operation, and came out through the main entrance into the gray November morning. A car was waiting. Walsh was standing beside it, which Mara hadn't anticipated. Walsh looked at her with the direct, evaluating attention that seemed to be her default mode, and probably always would be. "We need to talk about Clearview," Walsh said. "I know." Mara looked at her. "I'm not making any decisions today." "That's fine." Walsh's mouth moved toward something that was almost a smile. "Today I just came to make sure this one got out safely." She looked at Delaney. "Don't push the recovery. I mean it. You say that every time. You ignore me every time. I appreciate the consistency." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and opened the car door. Delaney transferred into the passenger seat with the careful economy of a man managing pain he still refused to name, and Colt settled in the back with the composed efficiency of a working animal who understood that his job was to be where his partner was. Mara stood on the hospital steps and watched the car until it reached the end of the entrance road and turned onto the main street and was gone. Then she stood there a moment longer, looking at the parking lot, the gray sky, the ordinary Saturday morning traffic on the road beyond. She was standing in front of a building that had spent 8 months trying to make her small and had failed, and which was now in the beginning stages of a reckoning that would take months to complete and would be uncomfortable and imperfect and would not undo the harm that had been done, but would, if it went the way it needed to go, prevent a significant quantity of future harm. Her phone vibrated. A message from Voss. "I called the Clearview nurse. She has significant documentation. She's also identified 2 colleagues with additional records. I'd like you on a call with the 3 of them Monday morning, if you're willing." Mara read it once. She started to type a reply. Then she stopped because Walsh was still standing at the bottom of the hospital steps behind her. She'd heard the car leave, but Walsh had apparently stayed. And Walsh said, "Before you answer that." Mara turned. Walsh was holding a folder. Physical, not digital. She held it out. "This came through the declassification review this morning," Walsh said. "I had it expedited." She paused. "It's the formal military commendation from the Mahad operation, the one you asked to be withdrawn in 2017. Mara looked at the folder. She didn't take it immediately. "You withdrew it," Walsh said. "That was your right. But the record of the commendation, the fact of it, that exists independently of whether you accepted it, it always existed. It was just filed in a place you couldn't see." She extended the folder slightly. "It belongs to you, whatever you decide to do with it." Mara took the folder. It was lighter than she expected, the way important things often were. A few pages of institutional language that described, in the compressed formal vocabulary of military documentation, 4 hours in a building in Mahad province, and 3 men who came home because of what happened inside it. She didn't open it. Not here. She held it at her side. The counter-allegation, she said. Dismissed, Walsh said, as of yesterday afternoon. Ashby's attorney withdrew it when it became clear that pursuing it would accelerate rather than delay his client's cooperation requirements. She paused. They withdrew it because the alternative was Walsh's formal response entering the federal record and becoming publicly accessible. They did not want that. Smart. Correct. Walsh looked at her steadily. Mara, the Monday call with Voss and the Clearview nurses. You don't have to take it. No one is going to ask you to be something you didn't sign up for. I know. But I want you to know, if you do take it, you won't be doing it alone, not the way you did the last 8 months. Walsh's voice had something in it that was not typical of her register. Not softer exactly, but more direct. The kind of directness that dropped the professional framework for a moment and just said the actual thing. You did that alone because you had to. You don't have to anymore. Mara looked at her. She thought about the apartment with the second-hand table and the month-to-month lease and the waterproof folder under the bathroom sink. She thought about the careful, deliberate smallness of the life she'd built and the 8 years of believing that smallness was the same as safety. She thought about the nurse at Clearview who had 2 years of records and didn't know who to send them to. I'll be on the call Monday, she said. Walsh nodded. She turned toward her car. Walsh? Mara stopped her. The commendation, the Mahad operation. She paused. The 3 men. Are they still all 3? Walsh said, without turning back. All 3 are fine. She got in her car and drove away. Mara stood on the hospital steps in the November morning with the folder in her hand, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of standing somewhere and not calculating the distance to the exit. Her phone vibrated again. Not Voss this time. An unknown number, different from the one 2 days ago. She answered it because she had gotten into the habit, over the past week, of answering unknown numbers. Is this Mara Quinn? The voice was female, young, slightly unsteady in the way of someone who has rehearsed a call and is now actually making it and finding it harder than the rehearsal. I'm a nurse at Dunmore Regional Hospital. I found your name through someone at Clearview who said you were the person to call. A pause. I've been keeping notes for 8 months. My director keeps shutting down my flags and I don't know what to do, and I thought maybe... You called the right person, Mara said. Tell me your name. A pause. Then, Sasha. Sasha Moreno. Okay, Sasha. Mara started down the hospital steps, folder under her arm, phone to her ear, moving forward into a gray morning that had nothing resolved about it except the direction. Start at the beginning, take your time. I'm listening. Sasha Moreno talked for 22 minutes. Mara walked the length of the hospital parking lot twice while she listened. Not pacing, just moving, because she processed better when her body was doing something simple and forward. She didn't interrupt except to ask for clarification on specific details. Dates, patient identifiers where Sasha had them, the exact language her director had used when closing out her flags. She asked those questions the way she asked all clinical questions, precisely, without inflection, because precision was what the situation needed, not comfort. The story was familiar in its architecture. Different hospital, different director, different specific mechanism. Dunmore Regional was smaller than Hartwell, a 60-bed community facility 2 hours north. But the pattern underneath was the same. A nurse who paid close attention. A department that processed her attention as a problem rather than an asset. Documentation that disappeared or was reclassified. A performance review file that was thickening in ways that had nothing to do with her actual performance. Sasha had caught a medication error that had reached the patient. She had documented it through the hospital's formal incident reporting system. 3 days later, the incident report had been amended. She wasn't sure how, she hadn't done it, to reclassify the event as a near miss that had been caught prior to patient contact, which was false, which meant there was now a formal record contradicting what she knew had happened, and she was the only person who seemed to be bothered by this. Is the patient okay? Mara asked, when Sasha reached that part. Yes. The harm was... It was limited. He's fine now. A pause. But that's not the point. No, Mara agreed. It isn't. I can't prove I didn't amend that report myself. That's what I'm scared of. If they come after me, the record shows the amendment on my login, but I didn't do it. Someone used my credentials. Do you have a personal copy of the original report before the amendment? A silence. I took a screenshot. Before I knew what was happening, I didn't know why I did it. That was the right instinct, Mara said. Don't delete it. Don't send it from your work email or your personal email to anyone yet. I'm going to give you the direct contact for a federal investigator at the OIG. Her name is Voss. You call her today, not Monday. Today. She stopped walking. Sasha, what you're describing, the credential use, the record amendment, that's not just an administrative irregularity. If Dunmore is connected to the same network I think it might be, there are people who already know how to investigate this. You don't have to figure out the whole structure yourself. Is it part of what's happening at Hartwell? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. She paused. You did the right thing keeping notes. You did the right thing calling. A longer pause this time. When Sasha spoke again, her voice had shifted. Still unsteady, but with something underneath the unsteadiness that was less like fear and more like the particular fragile relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for too long and has just been allowed to set it down for a moment. I looked you up, Sasha said, after the person at Clearview gave me your name. There wasn't much. Your name is barely in the news coverage about Hartwell. It mostly just says whistleblower. She paused. But one article quoted Commander Walsh. She said the investigation wouldn't exist without the nurse who kept records when the system was designed to ignore them. Mara said nothing for a moment. I just wanted you to know I read that, Sasha said, and that it mattered. That it made me think maybe keeping my notes wasn't pointless. It wasn't pointless, Mara said. Give me your number. I'll follow up personally after you've spoken with Voss. She ended the call. She stood in the parking lot with her phone in one hand and the commendation folder in the other, and the gray November morning around her, and she felt the weight of the conversation settling. Not the burden of it, but the actual mass of something real. Another person. Another hospital. Another set of records that someone had tried to make disappear. She texted Voss. Call Sasha Moreno today, not Monday. Dunmore Regional. Possible credential theft and record amendment. Maybe connected to Meridian Network. Voss responded in 4 minutes. On it. Mara put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the commendation folder one more time, then put it in her bag. She walked to her car. She had a lot of work to do. The months that followed did not move cleanly. That was the first thing to understand about them. They moved the way complicated things moved, in fits and delays and sudden accelerations, with bureaucratic friction at every turn and moments of genuine progress, interspersed with periods where it seemed like the machinery was grinding and getting nowhere. Gerald Pratt was formally charged in February. Not quietly. The federal indictment was a 15-count document covering healthcare fraud, wire fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. And it named Pratt as the architect of a scheme that had operated across 7 hospitals in 3 states over 9 years. The press release from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit was 4 paragraphs. The actual indictment was 63 pages. Mara read all 63 pages on a Wednesday evening sitting at her kitchen table, the second-hand one, which she had decided to keep, because she'd stopped thinking about furniture as a statement about permanence and started thinking about it as furniture. With a cup of coffee that went cold while she read. She read slowly and completely, the way she read everything that mattered, and when she finished, she sat for a while in the quiet of her apartment and thought about 9 years. The length of it. The number of people who had moved through hospital systems during that period and whose harm had been fed into a spreadsheet and managed away. She thought about what Ashby had said. I wasn't what I became here. She believed him, in the limited sense that she believed most people didn't start out intending to become the thing they eventually became. The road from a person who makes one compromise to a person who has been compromising for years was not a dramatic road. It was made of small steps in the same direction, each one individually defensible, the accumulation invisible, until you looked back and saw how far you'd traveled from the place you started. That didn't make the outcome different, but it was worth understanding, because understanding it was the difference between seeing what had happened as the result of one corrupt man's individual choices and seeing it as the result of a system that had created conditions in which certain choices were easy and other choices, the right ones, were made expensive. Pratt had designed the system, but the system had depended on a specific kind of institutional culture in each of the 7 hospitals to survive. That culture was what needed to change, and changing it was slower and less satisfying than a federal indictment and didn't make the news. Mara was working on the slower part. She had taken the OIG consulting role in December, formalized in January, and structured it in a way that let her continue practicing as a nurse while also serving as a clinical consultant to the federal investigation and to the remediation efforts at the affected hospitals. It was not a clean arrangement. It created scheduling conflicts and occasional jurisdictional confusion and required her to maintain a clear separation between her clinical work and her investigative work, which took more active management than she'd expected. She had also, after some deliberation, accepted a part-time teaching position at the Regional Nursing School's emergency medicine program, 2 mornings a week. She taught clinical assessment, the practical mechanics of reading a patient fast and accurately under conditions that were not ideal and would never be ideal. She taught it without softening the reality that the clinical environment was sometimes adversarial, that the system's nurses worked inside were imperfect and sometimes actively hostile to the instincts that made good nurses good, and that knowing how to document correctly and persistently was not a bureaucratic inconvenience but a clinical skill with direct patient safety implications. Her students were mostly 22, 23 years old. They were not naive. Nursing students at that level had already been through enough clinical rotation to understand that the job was harder than the brochure suggested. But they were still in the stage of learning where they believed that if they did everything correctly, the system would work correctly around them. She did not disabuse them of this entirely, but she did tell them, on the first morning of each new cohort, "You will work in environments that do not always support your best instincts. The question isn't whether that will happen. The question is what you do when it does, so we're going to talk about that." Ashby's sentencing happened in March. He had cooperated extensively with the federal case. His testimony about Pratt's recruitment methods, his preserved audio recordings, his documentation of the internal communication protocols had been central to the indictment. The prosecutors had argued for sentencing consideration on the basis of that cooperation. His attorney had argued for significant reduction on the same basis. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Ellerman, who had been on the federal bench for 14 years and who had the reputation of someone who listened carefully and decided independently, sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised release, permanent revocation of his medical license in all jurisdictions, and full restitution to the 7 patients or their families who had been identified as having suffered direct harm from the reclassification scheme. She also delivered a formal statement from the bench that was not typical practice, but which Judge Ellerman apparently felt the circumstances warranted. She said, "The harm in this case was not caused by a single act of violence or a moment of catastrophic failure. It was caused by a sustained, systematic choice to prioritize institutional liability over patient well-being, a choice that was made possible by a culture in which the people who raised concerns were penalized for raising them, while the people who suppressed those concerns were rewarded. The court wants to be clear. The nurses and clinical staff who documented their observations and who were subsequently disciplined for doing so were not the problem in this system. They were the system working correctly. The problem was what happened to them afterward." Mara was in the courtroom for the sentencing. She sat in the public gallery with Voss and Erickson and Donna Oates, who had taken a personal day to attend, and who sat very still through the sentencing and did not say anything for a long time afterward. Reese was also there. He'd come alone, which Mara hadn't expected, and he looked older than he had in November. Not dramatically, just the specific aging that comes from having been through something that required you to make a decision about who you were. He'd stayed at Hartwell through the investigation and the transition period, which had taken a specific kind of daily courage that she thought went undiscussed in the public record of what had happened there. After the sentencing in the marble corridor outside the courtroom, he found her. "You told me it would get easier after the first step," he said. "Did it?" He thought about it. "It got different," he said. "I'm not sure easier is the right word, but different is okay. Different is enough." She looked at him. "You're going to be a good doctor." He blinked. He looked like someone who had not expected to hear that today and was not quite sure how to receive it. And how do you know? Because you were scared and you did it anyway. That's the whole job, most of the time. She paused. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't, which was sometimes the right decision. He left. Pratt's trial ran for 11 days in April and May. It was a federal proceeding and therefore methodical in a way that felt slow from the outside but was, by the standards of complex healthcare fraud litigation, efficient. 63 counts were presented, and the prosecution's case was built on the documentation that had accumulated from 7 hospitals. The audio recordings Ashby had retained, the forensic analysis of the record modification system, and the testimony of 11 clinical staff members across the affected facilities who had flagged concerns, been disciplined, and had their documentation subsequently altered or erased. Sasha Moreno testified. She had been terrified in the weeks leading up to it. Mara had spoken with her 4 times during that period, not to coach her, but simply to be present in the way that mattered. And she had walked into the federal courtroom and sat in the witness chair and told exactly what she had seen, in the flat, careful language of someone who had spent 2 years writing things down precisely because she understood that precision was protection. Dunmore Regional had, as Mara had suspected, been connected to the Meridian network. Pratt had recruited Dunmore's department head in the same way he'd recruited Ashby. A direct approach, a presentation of the liability management system as a compliance tool, a financial arrangement dressed up as legitimate consulting. The records at Dunmore had yielded 4 additional patient harm cases that had been reclassified. All 4 were now part of the restitution calculation. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned guilty on 51 of 63 counts. The remaining 12 were dismissed on procedural grounds that had nothing to do with Pratt's guilt and everything to do with the complexity of proving specific intent in layered corporate structures. He was sentenced in July. 11 years. Permanent disbarment from any role in healthcare administration, insurance, or actuarial practice in any jurisdiction. Asset forfeiture. Restitution totaling $4.3 million to be distributed to the patients and families identified as having been harmed across all 7 facilities. He stood for sentencing with the contained, precise posture of a man who had built his career on the management of other people's risk, and who was now, for the first time, standing inside a consequence he had not been able to manage away. He said nothing when the sentence was read. He had the expression of a man making internal calculations about appeal prospects, which was probably accurate, and which would prove over the following year to be calculations that did not yield the outcome he anticipated. Mara was not in the courtroom for Pratt's sentencing. She had been in the courtroom for Ashby's. She did not feel the need to attend both, and she had a class to teach that morning that she did not cancel. She found out about the verdict by text from Voss, mid-morning, between sessions with 2 groups of nursing students. She read it, sent back a single word, good, and went back to teaching. Hartwell Regional Medical Center underwent a complete leadership restructuring between December and April. Whitfield stayed on as administrator, but with a significantly reduced scope and with a new compliance officer, an external appointment, a woman named Dr. Helene Park, who came from the State Health Department and who arrived on her first day with a list of questions that Hartwell's existing administrative team found uncomfortable in answering, which consumed the better part of her first 3 months. The ER got a new director, Dr. Felicia Park, the trauma surgeon who had operated on Marcus Delaney, who had told Mara on the night of the surgery that her clinical assessment had saved 8 minutes, and who had, in the months since, demonstrated the kind of departmental leadership that came from someone who actually understood what the department's job was. She was not a comfortable manager. She was direct to the point of occasional bluntness, and had very little patience for the kind of institutional performance that substituted for actual clinical accountability. But the ER's incident report rate increased by 30% in her first 60 days, which meant people were reporting, which meant the system was beginning to work in the direction it was supposed to work. Donna Oates became the department's charge nurse coordinator. She took the role seriously in a way that was visible to everyone who worked near her. Not loudly, not through grand gestures, but through the daily accumulated practice of asking the question she hadn't asked enough before. What are you seeing that I should know about? She asked at every shift. She wrote down the answers. In May, Hartwell hosted a formal recognition event for the nursing and clinical staff who had been identified in the OIG inquiry as having filed concerns that were subsequently suppressed. 11 people. Their personnel records had been reviewed, the disciplinary actions connected to their clinical flags had been removed, and the hospital had issued formal written acknowledgments, individual letters, specific to each person's documented concerns and the actions taken against them, that the complaints had been improper and the clinical concerns legitimate. Mara was also formally recognized. Her termination from the trauma rotation had been documented as retaliatory and removed from her record. Her original employment agreement had been reinstated, with back pay for the period of administrative leave. She came to the event. She wore what she wore to work: clean, functional, not a statement. She shook hands with the administrator and the new compliance officer and accepted the formal documentation that was handed to her in an envelope that she put in her bag without opening in front of anyone. She also accepted, on behalf of Sasha Moreno, who had been unable to come due to her own hospital's ongoing remediation schedule, but who had sent a message through Mara that was 3 sentences long and required Mara to read it twice to get through it cleanly, a separate acknowledgement of Sasha's role in the Dunmore investigation. The event was in the hospital's large conference room, with 40 or so people in attendance: administrative staff, clinical staff, people from the OIG office, a representative from the state health department. There was coffee, and there were pastries, and there was the particular slightly awkward energy of an institutional acknowledgement of institutional failure, which is a thing that organizations are never quite sure how to calibrate. Walsh was there. She stood near the door for most of it with the characteristic posture of someone who prefers to observe from the perimeter. And when Mara looked at her across the room, Walsh gave the minimal nod that was apparently her version of a wide range of positive communications. Delaney was there. He was walking without assistance, had been for 6 weeks, and he looked like himself again, which meant he looked like a man whose physical presence had a specific weight and authority that had been temporarily suspended by a significant abdominal surgery and had now been returned. He was in civilian clothes, the same dark practical register as always, and Colt was with him in vest and at heel, which meant this was not a casual visit. After the formal portion concluded and the room decomposed into smaller conversations, he came to find her. She was at the coffee station, which had been the right place to be for the past 40 minutes, because it was the station people came to when they needed a moment to not be in the middle of the room. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said. "I'd rather be teaching, or doing anything with a clear objective." She looked at the pastry she'd been holding without eating for 10 minutes. "I'm not good at events." Nobody's good at events. Some people are just better at hiding it. He stood beside her with the easy, unhurried quality of someone who is comfortable not filling silence. "How's the teaching going?" "Well," she paused, "I have a student who reminds me of Reese. Younger, different situation, but the same instinct. Notices things she's not sure she's allowed to notice." "What do you tell her?" "I tell her she's allowed." Mara set down the pastry. "I tell all of them they're allowed. That noticing things correctly is the job. That the discomfort of acting on what you notice is not evidence that you're wrong." She paused. "Some of them believe me immediately. Some of them take longer." "Sounds like a worthwhile thing to be doing with a morning." "Most mornings, yes." She looked at him. "You're fully cleared? Medically?" "As of 3 weeks ago. Full return." He paused. "Colt's back in rotation. It's good. It's where we're supposed to be." She nodded. There was something in the way he said it, "where we're supposed to be," that carried the simple weight of a person who had found the alignment between what they were and what they were doing, and she thought about that for a moment without comment. "There was something I wanted to tell you," he said. "In person. I could have called, but..." He stopped. "Ryan Talbot. He's one of the men from Mahad, the one in medical school." She looked at him. "He starts his emergency medicine residency in September," Delaney said. "He asked me to tell you. He said he wanted you to know specifically." He paused. "He said he's been trying to figure out for a long time what you did in that building, technically, how you kept 3 people alive with the resources you had in those conditions. He said he's been reverse engineering it from what he remembers." A brief pause. "He said he thinks about it when he's tired and when the cases are hard, that it's what he goes back to." The conference room noise was around them. Voices, the occasional sound of a cup being set down, the general ambient texture of 40 people in an enclosed space. Mara stood in the middle of it, and felt the particular quality of something arriving that she hadn't known she needed to hear. She didn't say anything for a moment, not because she had nothing to say, but because some things needed a moment before words were the right response. "Tell him to be stubborn," she finally said, in the specific way. Not stubborn about being right, stubborn about looking until he finds the thing he's missing. There's always a thing you're missing. The good ones look until they find it. Delaney nodded. He'd take that back. She knew he would. "One more thing," he said, "and then I'll leave you to your coffee." He looked at her directly, the same level assessment she'd been on the receiving end of since the recovery room. "The person you were in that trauma bay, the one you've been for the past 8 months, the one you clearly are in a classroom every Tuesday and Thursday morning." He paused. "That's not the military. That's not nursing. That's not any institution or role or title." He held her gaze. "That's just who you are. I wanted to say that clearly, in a room full of people, because I think you've spent a long time letting other people define the frame and then working inside it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He moved off toward Walsh, and Colt moved with him in the precise, unhurried way of a working animal that had never been confused about his purpose. She left the event at noon. She walked out of the hospital the same way she'd walked out every day for 8 months. Through the main entrance, past the reception desk, through the automatic doors into whatever weather was happening. Today it was warm. May had finally committed to warmth in the way that the Mid-Atlantic did sometimes, genuinely, without the cold reversions that characterized April. The air outside had the quality of a thing that had been waiting and had now arrived. She sat in her car in the parking lot and opened the envelope she'd been carrying in her bag since the formal portion of the event. Inside was the letter from Hartwell's administration, the formal acknowledgement, the personnel record corrections, the language of institutional regret that was never quite adequate and was also the best that institutions could produce. She read it. She folded it back. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the other document, the commendation folder that Walsh had given her in this same parking lot 6 months ago. She had read it twice in the interim and then put it back in the bag that she carried to work every day, not on display, not filed away in a box somewhere, but present. There. She opened it now and read it a third time. It was not a dramatic document. Military commendations rarely were. They compressed significant events into institutional language, which was both a limitation and a kind of accuracy. It described the Mahad operation in precise, functional terms. It described the actions of the assigned specialist medic. It noted that 3 personnel who required immediate surgical intervention had survived to full recovery as a direct result of those actions. It recommended formal commendation. It was signed by 3 officers. At the bottom, in the administrative note field, was a single line: "Commendation withdrawn at request of subject 2017, reactivated and formally accepted 2024. She had not been present for the formal acceptance. Walsh had handled that on her behalf, with her authorization, and had sent the paperwork through without ceremony. That was how Mara had wanted it. She looked at the line, formally accepted. She closed the folder. She sat for another minute, looking at the hospital through the windshield. The building she'd worked in for 8 months. The building that had spent a significant portion of that time trying to make her small enough to manage, and which had discovered, at some cost to itself, that the effort was not going to produce the intended result. She thought about the things she'd learned in those 8 months that she hadn't expected to learn. Not the clinical things. She'd known those. The other things. She'd learned that institutional systems were not separate from the people inside them. They were made of people, maintained by people, and changed only when people inside them decided that change was necessary and paid the cost of insisting on it. The system Pratt had built had required complicity at every level. Not malicious complicity, usually, but the quieter kind. The look-away kind. The "this doesn't concern me" kind that accumulated into a structure of harm as real as anything deliberately designed. She'd learned that the people who disrupted that kind of system were almost never the people who had the most power in it. They were almost always the people with the least, the ones who couldn't afford to look away because the harm was arriving in front of them and the cost of ignoring it was paid by someone else. Nurses, usually. Technicians. The people close enough to patients to see what was actually happening, and far enough from authority to understand that seeing it clearly was not the same as being allowed to say so. She'd learned that documentation was not bureaucratic tedium. It was armor. It was the difference between a concern that existed and a concern that could be proven, and in systems that operated by controlling which truths were visible, making a truth visible was the foundational act of every other action that followed. And she'd learned, this was the one that had taken the longest, that she was still not entirely sure she'd learned completely, that disappearing was not the same as healing, that she had left the military and built a careful, contained life, and told herself it was peace when it was also, at least partly, avoidance. That the skills she'd tried to put down were not the problem. The problem was the environment she'd been carrying them into. The right environment made everything different. Not easier, different. She started the car. She had a 2-hour-long PM call with Voss and the Clearview compliance team. She had a class to prepare for Thursday. She had 11 nurses across 4 hospitals who were in various stages of documentation review, and 3 of them had questions she needed to answer by end of week. She had work to do. Real work. The kind that had clear stakes and required specific knowledge and produced results that could be measured in whether people were harmed less or more. The most direct measure there was, and the one that had always been, at the center of everything she did, the point. She pulled out of the parking space. As she reached the exit of the hospital's lot, she passed Donna Oates walking back from the parking structure on the other side of the building. Apparently they'd both chosen the same time to leave. Donna saw her car and raised a hand in the undemonstrative wave of 2 people who had been through something together and had arrived at the particular shorthand that such experiences produced. Mara raised a hand back. She turned onto the main road and drove. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in August, she stood in front of a new cohort of nursing students, 18 of them, in the second-floor classroom that smelled like dry erase marker and the recycled air of a building designed for winter. And she looked at them for a moment before she began. They were young. They had the careful, slightly anxious energy of people who had worked very hard to be exactly where they were and who were now aware that the work was about to become a different kind of hard. They had notebooks open. Some of them had laptops. A few of them had the particular stillness of people who had already made their decision about what they were going to do with their lives and were simply waiting for the knowledge to arrive. She thought about what they were walking into. Not to frighten them, they would encounter the reality soon enough, but because she took seriously the responsibility of what it meant to prepare someone for it, to give them not just the clinical knowledge, but the orientation, the framework for what to do when the environment didn't support what they knew to be right. "My name is Mara Quinn," she said. "I'm going to teach you clinical assessment. But before we get into any of that, I want to tell you something about this job that nobody told me when I started." They looked at her. 18 people, notebooks open, paying attention. "You're going to notice things," she said. "In your career, in your departments, at the bedside, and in the chart room, and in the handoff at the end of a shift. You are going to notice things that other people miss, or that other people know and are not saying, or that other people have decided it is easier not to see." She paused. "The noticing is not the hard part. The hard part is deciding what you do with what you notice." The room was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you it's easy to act on what you see. I'm not going to tell you the system will always support you when you do. I'm not going to promise you that the right call produces the right outcome every time, because it doesn't, and you deserve to know that before you're standing in a room where it matters." She looked at them, one face at a time, not hurrying. "What I'm going to tell you is this. The skill of seeing clearly is the most important thing you will ever develop in this job. And the courage to act on what you see is not separate from that skill. It is part of it. It is the part that protects people." She let that land. "We're going to spend the next 12 weeks on the mechanics," she said. "Assessment, documentation, clinical reasoning under pressure. We're going to do it until you can do it without thinking, and then we're going to do it more until you can do it while thinking about 6 other things simultaneously." She paused. "And along the way, we're going to talk about what you do when the environment makes it hard. Because it will make it hard. Not always, but enough." One of the students in the second row, a young woman with a specific quality of attention that Mara recognized, had always recognized, in the people who were going to be very good at this, raised her hand. "Yes," Mara said. "What do you do when you see something wrong and nobody listens?" The question sat in the room. 18 people waiting for the answer. Mara looked at the student. She thought about 8 months of documentation in a waterproof folder. She thought about a trauma bay, a fast exam, a patient who asked her a question that opened a door she'd been keeping shut for 8 years. She thought about a commendation folder in her bag that said formally accepted, and a Tuesday morning class that she had not canceled even on the day a verdict came in. She thought about Sasha Moreno, who had kept 2 years of notes and had not known who to send them to, and who now knew. "You write it down," Mara said. "Precisely, and with dates, and in a format that will survive whatever comes next. You learn to document so well that the truth you're carrying cannot be erased." She held the student's gaze. "And then you find the person who knows what to do with it. There is always someone. It took me a long time to understand that. But there is always someone." She turned to the board. "Let's start with assessment," she said. "Patient arrives in your bay. You have 60 seconds before the attending gets there. Tell me everything you'd look for." A hand went up. Then another. Then the room came alive with the specific energy of people learning to see, and Mara stood at the front of it and taught. Outside the window, the August morning was bright and ordinary, and without particular drama. Inside the room, 18 people were beginning to learn how to pay attention in the way that protected people, which was, she had come to understand, the most necessary thing she knew how to teach. She had been a medic. She had been a nurse. She had been invisible for 8 years by choice and visible for 8 months by necessity, and she had learned that the label on the thing was never the thing itself. The thing itself was this: seeing clearly and staying. That was the whole of it. Everything else was just the shape it took on a given day.